Paolo and Francesca. Love condemned for eternity. What if one forbidden kiss could echo louder than war, marriage, and even death itself? In the shadowed world of medieval Italy, Paolo Malatesta and Francesca da Rimini become more than lovers caught in a private tragedy. They become symbols of longing, frailty, and the terrible cost of desire. Their names come to us through centuries, not as distant relics, but as two human hearts caught in a net woven long before they ever reached for one another. This narration follows their story from the political forces that bound them to their fate, to the immortal sorrow that keeps their names alive across centuries. It begins not with romance, but with a world where power spoke more loudly than tenderness, and where a marriage could be arranged like a treaty, sealed not by love, but by necessity. And in that world, one moment of feeling would become an eternal sentence. If you find this useful, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment. There is something especially haunting about stories like this, because they do not begin with villains in dark rooms, or with reckless hearts searching for danger. They begin with duty, with family, with the quiet expectations placed upon a daughter, a son, a noble house struggling to survive among rival cities and shifting loyalties. They begin in halls of stone, in councils spoken over maps and bloodlines, in the measured language of advantage. By the time love enters the story, the path has already been narrowed. By the time desire dares to speak, the walls are already closing in. To understand Paolo and Francesca, we have to enter that older Italy, fragmented and watchful, restless beneath the banners of proud city-states. This was not a unified country, but a landscape of competing powers, alliances, vendettas, and ambitions. Rimini, Ravenna, Pesaro, Florence, and countless other centers of influence lived in a constant state of negotiation and suspicion. Noble families did not simply protect their honor, they traded it, defended it, sharpened it into a weapon. A marriage between great houses was rarely a matter of private happiness. It was a statement, a promise, a strategy against isolation, a shield against enemies. Sometimes it was even a pause in violence, thin and fragile as glass. In such a world, affection was a luxury, and freedom of the heart was often treated as a dangerous indulgence. A daughter born into a noble house did not belong solely to herself. Her future could be discussed by fathers, brothers, allies, and rivals long before she fully understood what was being decided. A son, too, carried burdens not entirely his own. He might be expected to strengthen the family name, to serve military and political goals, to present obedience where his private wishes were irrelevant. The individual life, as we often imagine it today, was pressed under the weight of lineage. Love was not always absent, but it was not the foundation. Duty survival came first, reputation came first, and so, before we even speak of the lovers, we must speak of the terms that shaped them. Francesca da Rimini was born into this world of calculation and ceremony. She was the daughter of a powerful family, raised within the expectations that surrounded noble women of her time. We can imagine intelligence in her, refinement, sensitivity, and the kind of awareness that grows in people who understand from an early age that their lives may be directed by hands other than their own. Over time, history would remember her not through the full breadth of her daily existence, but through the sorrow that consumed it. That is one of the cruelties of legend. A person becomes a symbol, a woman becomes a warning, or a poem, or a memory suspended forever in a single act. Yet before she became tragic, she was alive inside a world making choices for her. Paolo Malatesta enters the story with a different kind of burden. Handsome, admired, associated in later memory with grace and charm, he belonged to the formidable Malatesta family, a dynasty deeply entangled in the politics of the Romagna region. If Francesca would be remembered for tenderness and grief, Paolo would be remembered as the figure whose presence awakened what should never have been awakened. But he, too, was more than a romantic image. He was a nobleman shaped by duty, family allegiance, and the expectations placed upon men whose value extended beyond themselves. His face, his bearing, his reputation. These things mattered in a culture where appearance could influence trust, respect, and alliance. Then there is Giovanni Malatesta, Paolo's brother, the man Francesca would marry. In retellings, Giovanni often stands at the edge of the emotional center, known less as a full human being than as the husband, the obstacle, the wrong match, the harsh fact around which the tragedy tightens. History can be merciless in this way. Yet Giovanni, too, belonged to the same brutal logic of his age. His marriage was not simply a private union but a political arrangement, one that tied families together for practical gain. If Paolo and Francesca have long drawn sympathy as lovers, Giovanni remains tied to the cold architecture of power, the structure that made such love impossible from the beginning. This is where the true conflict takes shape, and it is more painful than a simple tale of betrayal. The sorrow at the heart of this story is not only that two people fell in love when they should not have. It is that the very arrangement meant to secure order created the conditions for emotional catastrophe. A marriage built for strategy left no room for the heart, but it did not destroy the heart's capacity to feel. Instead, it trapped longing inside a house where it could not breathe openly. Public duty and private emotion were forced to live side by side, each threatening the other, each sharpening the stakes of every glance, every silence, every act of restraint. That is what makes this story endure. It does not ask us merely to witness forbidden love. It asks us to witness how systems of power shape intimacy, how family ambition can arrange a future while remaining blind to the inner life of the people living it. Francesca was not standing in a field of freedom choosing between equal roads. Paolo was not wandering outside consequence. Giovanni was not just a man in a love triangle. All three stood inside a culture where marriage was political, loyalty was public, and personal desire could ignite ruin with terrifying speed. There is also another reason their story lingers so deeply in the imagination. We recognize, even now, the unbearable tension between the life one is expected to live and the life one silently longs for. Most people, in one way or another, know what it means to carry feeling that does not fit the shape of duty. The medieval setting may seem distant at first, heavy with armor, banners, oaths, and dynastic calculations. But the emotional current is startlingly close. To want what you must not want. To feel yourself moved toward tenderness in a world that rewards obedience. To understand that one honest moment may cost everything. These are not dead emotions preserved in history. They are profoundly human ones. And yet, because this is medieval Italy, those feelings unfold under especially merciless conditions. Reputation is not merely personal, it is familial and political. Honor is not just a private sense of dignity, it is a public currency. A whisper can damage alliances, a suspicion can provoke bloodshed, a scandal can dishonor generations. In such an atmosphere, love does not remain a soft, inward thing. If discovered, it becomes explosive. It threatens more than a marriage. It threatens trust between houses, legitimacy, authority, and the fragile appearance of control that noble families work so carefully to maintain. This is why one moment of tenderness can become larger than battle. Wars leave scars on the land, but forbidden love leaves scars inside memory. A conflict may be recorded in dates, victories, and treaties. A kiss, if it comes at the wrong moment between the wrong people, can outlive armies because it exposes something warfare cannot, the weakness hidden inside human strength, the vulnerability hidden inside social order. It reveals that no arrangement, however strategic, can completely command the heart. And once that truth appears, even briefly, it cannot be unseen. When later generations return to Paolo and Francesca, they do not return only for scandal. They return for the ache beneath it, for the sense that these two figures were condemned not simply by passion, but by a world that had already decided what their lives were for. Their tragedy begins before the fateful turning point, before the secret feeling, before the fatal discovery. It begins in agreements made by others, in loyalties inherited at birth, in the old belief that a family's future could be secured by placing human hearts where they were most useful. So as we move closer to Francesca herself, closer to Paolo, closer to Giovanni and the household that bound them together, we should hold on to this emotional truth. No one enters the story untouched by the demands of their time. They are not modern lovers dressed in medieval costume. They are products of a harder order, one where tenderness survives only in narrow spaces, and where a private longing, once awakened, must either be silenced or destroy the life around it. There is a deep sadness in that even before the tragedy fully unfolds, because it means their downfall is not born from a single reckless act alone. It is born from pressure, from design, from a structure that treated marriage as settlement and emotion as irrelevant. It is born from the collision between what the world requires and what the heart discovers too late. In another life, perhaps Paolo's warmth would have remained harmless, Francesca's sensitivity would have found peace, and Giovanni's marriage would not have carried such hidden danger. But not here. Not in this Italy of proud houses and sharpened intentions. Not in a world where alliances are forged with human lives, and where desire, once named, becomes peril. By the time their story reaches its most intimate and devastating moments, we will already understand that the end was not created in an instant. It was prepared slowly, almost invisibly, by custom, by politics, by obedience, by the simple fact that no one asked whether love had a place in the arrangement at all. That is why their names still tremble with sadness, because they stand at the meeting point of two forces that rarely forgive one another, necessity and longing. And before their names became inseparable from sorrow, the world around them had already begun writing the terms of their destiny. The world that shaped Francesca was not a calm or private one. It was a world of city walls and family banners, of oaths spoken in public and betrayals whispered in chambers lit by oil lamps. In 13th century Italy, power rarely sat still. It shifted from hand to hand, from faction to faction, from one marriage contract to the next. A noble house could seem secure in one season and stand on the edge of ruin in the next. Every friendship carried caution inside it. Every peace had to be guarded. Every alliance was shadowed by the fear that it might fail. In lands like Romagna, where Ravenna and Rimini stood among ambitious neighboring powers, this instability was not an exception. It was the air people breathed. Families who ruled cities or held influence over them were never free to live only for themselves. Their decisions were watched, interpreted, and tested by rivals. The names they carried were not merely personal names. They were political instruments, signals of belonging, warnings to enemies, promises to allies. Honor was not an inward feeling alone. It was a public structure, something that had to be displayed, defended, and sometimes purchased at terrible cost. The great houses of the region lived in a condition of constant negotiation. Loyalties changed with the weather of opportunity. Old enemies dined together when necessity required it, and old allies could become dangerous once their interests no longer aligned. Behind the language of kinship and courtesy stood a colder truth. Survival depended on calculation. To govern, or even simply to remain secure, a family needed armed support, strategic marriages, and the appearance of unity. They needed to reduce threats before those threats could gather force. They needed to turn uncertainty into advantage wherever they could. This was especially true in the contested political culture of the Italian communes, where local pride, papal influence, imperial claims, and family ambition collided again and again. The famous factional names, Guelph and Ghibelline, were part of that struggle, but real life was often even more tangled than those labels suggest. A city might declare one loyalty, while its leading families pursued another. A ruler might present himself as faithful to a cause, while privately bargaining with men on the opposite side. Within this world, no household could afford innocence for long. Prudence was demanded of everyone, and from the powerful, more than prudence was expected. They were expected to be useful. That expectation fell with particular weight upon sons and daughters alike, but it did not fall in the same way. A son might be trained to lead men, to negotiate, to carry the family name openly into conflict. A daughter was trained just as carefully, though her path was narrower and no less burdened. She was taught grace, restraint, and poise. She learned how to listen, how to speak with measured intelligence, how to preserve dignity under scrutiny. Her body, her manners, her fertility, her conduct, even her silence, could all become part of a political language larger than herself. She might be beloved within her family, cherished for her gentleness or admired for her wit. And yet, from childhood she would understand, even if no one said it plainly, that her future was not hers alone. For daughters of noble houses, marriage was rarely imagined as a private union between two inward lives. It was an arrangement of interests, an instrument of diplomacy wrapped in ceremony. Through marriage, hostilities could be softened, claims strengthened, unstable borders steadied, mutual obligations created. A bride crossed not only into another household but into another web of expectations. She brought dowry, prestige, lineage, and the symbolic promise of peace. In return, she was expected to bring obedience, discretion, and endurance. If affection came later, that was welcome. If it did not, the marriage still stood. In such a world, a young woman's inner life had little formal authority. Her intelligence could make her admired, but not free. Her sensitivity could make her memorable, but not sovereign over her own fate. If she possessed imagination, if she felt deeply, if she noticed beauty in speech and gesture, and in the hidden movements of the heart, these qualities might enrich her private existence. Yet they offered no protection against the uses to which her life might be put. Refinement was valued, but chiefly because it reflected honorably on the house that had cultivated it. A daughter might be educated enough to charm, perceptive enough to understand the stakes around her, and emotionally alive enough to feel each sacrifice in full. None of that meant she would be asked what she wanted. Francesca grew within these conditions. Though the surviving record leaves much unsaid, tradition remembers her not as a coarse or indifferent figure, but as a woman of grace, intelligence, and feeling. It is easy to imagine her in the cultivated atmosphere of a noble household in Ravenna, where status required not only strength but polish. She would have learned the forms of noble behavior early, the measured courtesy expected in formal company, the awareness of rank, the careful management of expression. She would have heard conversation shaped by politics, by family strategy, by the names of neighboring powers and restless rivals. Even if shielded from the bluntest calculations, she could not have been untouched by them. Children in such households grew up quickly in the presence of consequence, and yet refinement creates its own kind of vulnerability. A sensitive mind does not suffer less because it understands more. Often it suffers more because it can sense what is being surrendered, even before the surrender is complete. If Francesca was observant, she would have understood that her future would likely be negotiated around her rather than with her. If she was intelligent, she would have recognized the language of necessity long before it was directed toward her own life. If she was gentle, that gentleness would not save her. It might simply make the violence of obedience quieter on the surface and deeper underneath. Her family, the da Polenta of Ravenna, did not move through history as spectators. They were themselves participants in the tense and opportunistic politics of the region. To remain influential, they had to navigate threat, rivalry, and advantage with care. Ravenna, proud and strategic, could not ignore what happened in Rimini, and Rimini could not ignore Ravenna. The Malatesta family, rising in power and formidable in ambition, were not distant figures in an abstract political drama. They were the kind of neighbors whose strength demanded response. Whether as rivals, partners, or both at once, they mattered. And when powerful houses matter to one another in such a climate, marriage becomes one of the most persuasive arguments they can make. The union arranged between Francesca and the Malatesta family must be understood in that light. It was not born from a love story waiting to unfold. It was born from pressure, calculation, and the desire to secure advantage while lessening danger. Such a marriage could help stabilize relations between strong houses whose interests might otherwise collide more violently. It could create a bond difficult to break without public consequence. It could signal trust, or at least the willingness to perform trust. It could reduce uncertainty, and uncertainty was one of the most feared conditions of political life. This is where the tragedy begins to take on its quieter shape. Not in the moment of passion for which the lovers are remembered, but here, in the earlier decision that defines the ground beneath their feet. Francesca is not first seen as a woman with a future of her own making. She is seen as the daughter through whom an alliance may pass. Her name enters negotiation before it enters love. Her worth, in the eyes of power, lies partly in what her marriage can accomplish for others. However gently the arrangement may have been presented, however honorably her elders may have believed they were acting, the structure remains the same. She is being placed. To be placed in marriage under such conditions was not unusual. That is precisely what makes it so haunting. Nothing about this arrangement would have seemed extraordinary to the world around her. Families of rank did this as a matter of course. They measured outcomes, weighed benefits, and advanced the interests of their house. A daughter who accepted her role could be praised as dutiful and noble. Her obedience would be counted as virtue. Her reluctance, if she felt any, would be expected to remain private, transformed into composure. The discipline demanded of her was not only practical but emotional. She was meant to align her face, her words, and eventually her life with a decision already made. This does not mean that families felt nothing. Affection and strategy often lived uneasily together. A father might care for his daughter and still bargain with her future. Brothers might honor her and still understand her marriage as a political necessity. The cruelty of such a system did not always come from personal hardness. Sometimes it came from collective belief, from the deep conviction that this was simply how stability was built and preserved. The more dangerous the world felt, the easier it became to justify private sacrifice in the name of public need. And so Francesca's gifts, whatever they were in their fullest human reality, could not protect her from becoming useful. Her intelligence could not alter the structure. Her refinement could not open a door locked by custom. Her sensitivity could only accompany her, silently, into whatever life had been chosen. In another kind of world, such qualities might have helped her shape her own destiny, or at least speak more freely into it. Here they made her poignant. They gave depth to a figure whose society required surface control. They remind us that beneath every formal alliance stood living hearts, vulnerable and unseen. The Malatesta connection, then, was never simply a wedding. It was an agreement between houses under pressure. It belonged to the logic of its century, to the practical imagination of families who measured danger in territorial and dynastic terms. Peace, or something resembling peace, had to be constructed out of available means, and daughters were among those means. This is painful to say, but to understand Francesca's fate, it must be said plainly. She was not first granted the freedom to choose, and then led tragically astray by emotion. She was denied that freedom from the beginning. The later drama of her heart unfolds within a life already arranged by others. That is why her story carries such enduring sorrow. We do not feel only the force of forbidden love. We feel the earlier confinement that made such love at once precious and perilous. We sense a young woman entering a future whose terms have been settled in the language of men, households, and necessity. We sense the distance between what she may have been inwardly and what the world required her to become outwardly. And in that distance, something fragile is already at risk. And in that arranged future, the name Francesca is promised not to a beloved, but to a household whose shadows she cannot yet measure. And in that arranged future, Francesca stands for a moment at a threshold that is both ordinary and immense. Before she becomes a wife in the eyes of politics and family, she is still, in some inward and vanishing sense, a daughter. She belongs to the world that formed her, to the rooms where she learned how to speak gently, how to lower her eyes without seeming weak, how to carry herself with that careful balance of grace and restraint expected of a noble woman. It is easy, from a distance, to see only the legend she would become. Harder, and more necessary, is to imagine the young woman herself before the legend closed around her. She was born into a culture that prized refinement not only in manners, but in feeling. The courts of Italy did not merely teach power, they staged beauty beside it. Songs, romances, and tales of noble conduct moved through these households like a second education. A young woman of rank would have heard stories in which love was elevated, disciplined, and made meaningful through loyalty, courtesy, and inward worth. She would have learned that the heart, though governed by duty, was not supposed to be coarse. Tenderness had a language, admiration had a ritual, virtue was adorned with poetry. Even if life rarely fulfilled such ideals, the ideals themselves still shaped expectation. They entered the imagination early and remained there. So it is possible to picture Francesca not as naive, but as delicately formed by contradiction. She may have known very well that marriages among the powerful were settled by advantage. She may have understood, long before her own turn came, that daughters were exchanged to secure peace, strengthen alliances, quiet disputes, or extend ambition. Yet knowing this is not the same as feeling untouched by it. A girl can be instructed in necessity and still quietly hope for kindness. She can be realistic in public and secretive in private. She can learn to expect little and still preserve, somewhere within herself, the faint image of being seen, heard, perhaps even cherished. Those quiet dreams would not have needed to be extravagant. They may have been small enough to survive unnoticed. Not fantasies of rebellion, but of gentleness. A husband who spoke without contempt. A household where she would not be feared into silence. A life in which duty and affection may not fully unite, at least coexist without cruelty. Such hopes are modest, almost painfully modest, and that is what makes them so moving. Francesca need not have dreamed of choosing freely in order to suffer from having no choice. It is enough to imagine her hoping that what she could not shape might still prove bearable, even tender in moments. It is enough to imagine her bringing to marriage not grand passion, but a human hunger for warmth, and yet the crossing from daughter to bride was often a kind of erasure. A noble son might inherit, negotiate, ride outward into the world with some visible extension of self. A noble daughter was more often prepared to depart from herself. Her value was bound to her capacity to preserve honor, obey arrangement, and embody composure during transition. She was expected to move from one household to another, with her dignity intact, as if dignity could cancel fear. Around her, adults would speak the language of advantage, prudence, necessity. The match would be discussed in terms larger than her. Names, territories, rivalries, peace between houses, mutual benefit. She, meanwhile, would be expected to absorb the consequences of those abstractions in the most intimate chamber of her life. What does that do to a spirit still forming? It teaches division. Outwardly, gratitude. Inwardly, uncertainty. Outwardly, acceptance. Inwardly, a gathering sorrow too premature to name. Francesca's emotional transition was not a single dramatic moment, but a slow inward adjustment to the fact that the future approaching her had been spoken for. There may have been hours when she tried to reason with herself, to call it honorable, to remember that many women before her had done the same and survived. There may have been moments of steadiness, even pride. To endure with grace was itself a form of nobility, but grace, when demanded, costs something. We should not mistake her composure for ease. Fear in such circumstances rarely announces itself loudly. It enters in fragments, in the strangeness of imagining unknown walls, in the thought of eating at a table where every face must be newly read, in wondering what kind of man waits at the center of this arrangement, and whether his temper, his habits, his silences will leave room for breath. Fear lives in details because the person experiencing it has so little power over outcomes. A young bride may not permit herself the luxury of saying, "I am afraid." Instead, she becomes more careful, more gracious, more resolved not to shame those who raised her. She'd around her uncertainty until it resembles poise. There is, too, a loneliness in being praised for silence. Noble womanhood often demanded a paradoxical excellence. One had to feel deeply enough to embody virtue, yet speak lightly enough never to burden others with one's true unrest. Restraint was admired, modesty was moralized, endurance was feminized and then celebrated. A woman who concealed distress could be called strong. A woman who voiced it risked seeming ungrateful, disorderly, or childish. Under such conditions, the inner life becomes crowded and speechless. One learns to just anguish into etiquette. Francesca, as a daughter of rank, would have been taught this translation early. She would know how to receive visitors, how to answer with measured courtesy, how to preserve the atmosphere around her from the intrusion of private pain. She would know that the body can perform serenity even when the mind trembles. This is not deception in some simple sense. It is survival shaped into elegance, but survival of that kind has a cost. When no ordinary room permits honesty, the heart begins to starve for recognition. Not indulgence, not rescue, simply recognition. To be met somewhere without performance. To have one's inward life answered rather than merely managed. That hunger matters. It matters because later generations are sometimes tempted to flatten Francesca into a figure overwhelmed by sudden desire, as though one glance, one conversation, one illicit spark were enough to explain the catastrophe. But human attachment rarely wounds so deeply in an emotional desert, unless it answers an older deprivation. What strikes the soul with such force is often not novelty alone, but relief. A sense, perhaps terrifying in its sweetness, that something long denied has finally been named by another presence. Before that happens, however, Francesca must live inside the interval of uncertainty. She enters marriage carrying more than obedience. She carries memory, temperament, and all the unspent feeling of a life disciplined before it could fully unfold. She brings with her whatever early tenderness she absorbed from stories, songs, and examples of refined conduct. She brings the habits of self-command that noble upbringing required. She brings fear she cannot publicly honor, and dignity she cannot afford to lose. The bride who crosses into a political household does not leave herself behind entirely. She brings a silent archive. It is worth lingering here, because this is where compassion deepens. Francesca's later choices, whatever judgment history or theology may place upon them, do not emerge from a heart untouched by sorrow. They emerge from a heart trained to conceal sorrow. There is a difference, and it is everything. The concealed life grows intense. What cannot be spoken gathers pressure. What cannot be sought openly becomes more radiant in imagination. Even ordinary kindness can begin to feel extraordinary when one has been deprived of emotional safety. Imagine her on the eve of departure, or on the road, or at the first entrance into a household not her own. She would be watched. Her bearing would matter. Every gesture could be interpreted as breeding or deficiency, strength or weakness. She would know this. She would understand that her first duty was not to reveal herself, but to regulate herself, to arrive in good order, to honor the alliance with visible calm, to reassure those around her that the transfer had been successful, that the daughter had become a bride without disturbance. How much private grief disappears under that social performance, history seldom records. And yet beneath the ceremonial surface, there is the more intimate reckoning. To marry without choosing is one thing. To discover, after marriage, whether one's humanity will be sheltered or neglected is another. In that unknown, resignation and hope do not cancel each other. They coexist. She may have resigned herself to the marriage while still hoping for decency within it. She may have feared disappointment while still arranging her thoughts around the possibility of peace. Human beings are made this way. We continue to hope where reason has already lowered its voice. That mingling of hope and dread gives Francesca her emotional depth. She is not merely innocent, nor merely resigned. She is attentive, disciplined, vulnerable, and alone in ways that her rank cannot protect against. Privilege gives her refinement, perhaps education, perhaps beauty in the eyes of others. It does not spare her from being handled as part of a settlement. It does not guarantee companionship. It does not grant her the right to speak the full truth of her own reluctance. The polished world around her may even intensify the loneliness, because its elegance leaves so little room for visible fracture. This is why the later bond that will define her story cannot be understood only as transgression. It must also be understood as recognition after deprivation. A person long deprived of emotional reciprocity does not fall in love merely with a face or a forbidden thrill. She may fall into the shock of being accompanied, into the unbearable softness of being understood, without having first to translate herself into acceptable silence. If Francesca had lived in a world that allowed her candor, if marriage had offered companionship, if her fears had been met with tenderness, rather than absorbed into expectation, then perhaps later feeling would have found a different measure. But deprivation alters proportion. It makes response feel like revelation. So, at this threshold, before sorrow has fully declared its shape, Francesca is already carrying the conditions that will make future feeling dangerous. She has been formed by ideals finer than the reality awaiting her. She has been taught to honor love in language while being denied agency in life. She has learned to keep her unrest hidden beneath noble composure. She has crossed from her father's world into another not through desire, but through arrangement. None of this excuses what comes later in the moral imagination of her age, but it does make it human. And to make it human is to feel, more painfully, how tragedy begins not only in sin or weakness, but in deprivation, silence, and the longing to be met. If Francesca enters marriage carrying hope mixed with dread, the man waiting within that arrangement will determine how quickly hope gives way to sorrow. Hope and dread are not opposites in a heart formed as hers was. They are companions, each sharpened by the nearness of the other, waiting only for circumstance to decide which one will govern the years ahead. That man was Giovanni Malatesta, known in many accounts less through the language of affection than through the language of rank, alliance, and force. He belonged to a world in which survival depended on hard edges. Cities rose and fell through negotiations sharpened by threat. Families secured themselves through loyalty, strategy, and displays of strength. A man in Giovanni's position was not expected to charm the world into obedience. He was expected to hold it, defend it, and, when necessary, intimidate it. Power had marked him long before marriage did. War, reputation, and the demands of lineage had given him a public shape that left little room for softness. Even the way history remembers him carries that severe outline. He is not usually introduced as a dreamer, or as a man whose inner life spilled generously into the lives of others. He appears instead as practical, formidable, perhaps feared, perhaps respected, certainly useful to the calculations of his house. Whether he possessed private gentleness that never entered the record is something no chronicler can restore with confidence. What remains visible is the role he occupied. A political man in a political age, trained to measure outcomes, not emotions, to secure bonds, not necessarily to nourish them. And this matters because marriage to such a man was never simply a meeting of two people. It was an extension of policy. Francesca did not step into a union designed around mutual recognition. She stepped into a structure already built by others, already serving purposes beyond her own heart. Whatever tenderness she may have imagined marriage could one day contain had to survive inside that structure, and structures built for stability are not always built for mercy. It would be too simple, and perhaps too theatrical, to imagine Giovanni only as a villain from the first moment, a husband made entirely of cruelty. Tragedy is often more suffocating than that. It is not always created by dramatic evil. Sometimes it is created by hardness that seems ordinary to the people living inside it. A man can fulfill the expectations of his station and still leave devastation in his wake. He can provide legitimacy, protection, a name, and material security, and still fail in the one place that makes shared life bearable. He may offer no tenderness, no listening, no warmth by which another soul can rest. That may be the most painful truth of Francesca's marriage. Its suffering need not depend on spectacular abuse to become a prison. Incompatibility can wound deeply when there is no language allowed for naming it. Distance can become its own quiet form of punishment. Severity, especially when considered natural or justified, can chill a household more thoroughly than rage. And sometimes what destroys hope is not violence at every hour, but the simple, relentless absence of mutual sweetness. Imagine what this would have meant for a woman like Francesca. Raised among ideals of refinement, conscious of the beauty and ceremony expected of noble life, perhaps carrying within her those early impressions of courtly language and elevated feeling, she enters a marriage where such language has no practical value. The qualities that might have flourished in a more responsive world, sensitivity, imagination, emotional intelligence, a longing to be cherished rather than merely placed, find themselves with nowhere honorable to go. They do not disappear. They turn inward. They become silence, restraint, loneliness disciplined into grace. Giovanni, shaped by a harsher logic, may have seen marriage as accomplished the moment its terms were fulfilled. The alliance existed. The bride had arrived. The household had absorbed its new lady. Duties could now proceed. In that understanding, affection was secondary, perhaps unnecessary. Respect may have been expected. Obedience, certainly. Public dignity, yes. But intimacy, the tender labor of learning another person's fears, desires, and hidden wounds, was not the center of this arrangement. It may never even have seemed essential. So the emotional balance of the marriage tilts from the beginning. Francesca is asked to inhabit a bond whose outward legitimacy cannot conceal its inward emptiness. Giovanni, by age, temperament, and formation, holds the power. He belongs to the world that made the decision. Francesca belongs to the world required to endure it. He may move through his days reinforced by role, by masculine privilege, by military and political purpose. She must find meaning inside enclosure. He acts. She adapts. He is answered by men, councils, conflicts, obligations. She is answered by walls, expectations, watchfulness, and the long discipline of composure. In such a household, duty becomes a daily garment that cannot be removed. Francesca's role is not to discover herself, but to perform herself correctly. She must be loyal, measured, decorous. She must not expose disappointment too openly, because noble women are often denied even the dignity of saying that they are unhappy. Their sorrow must be translated into patience. Their isolation must look like virtue. Their emotional hunger must remain invisible, lest it be judged ingratitude or moral weakness. This is how marriage can become a chamber of emotional confinement without ever ceasing to appear respectable from the outside. There is food, rank, order, perhaps even ceremony. The forms are intact. The emptiness is private, and private emptiness, when it cannot be spoken, grows larger than open conflict. It becomes the air itself. A woman wakes within it, speaks within it, dines within it, kneels within it. She carries her noble name through corridors that do not answer her heart. She learns the weight of being surrounded and yet profoundly unattended. One of the cruelest dimensions of arranged life is that endurance is mistaken for peace. If Francesca did not openly resist, then the arrangement could be called successful. If scandal did not erupt, then harmony could be presumed. But silence is not harmony. Submission is not comfort. A life can appear stable while inwardly starving, and the starvation of the heart is slow enough that others often call it normal. For Francesca, this likely meant a long education in restraint. Every disappointed expectation had to be folded away. Every impulse toward candor had to be checked against danger. If Giovanni was stern, distant, or emotionally inaccessible, she could not simply demand reciprocity in the modern sense. She lived in a moral and social order where marriage was binding, not because it fulfilled the soul, but because it secured family and legitimacy. She was not invited to ask whether she felt loved enough. She was expected to endure honorably whatever form the union took. That endurance should not be mistaken for passivity of feeling. On the contrary, those who are denied expression often feel with greater intensity, because nothing in them has been allowed to breathe naturally. A heart pressed into stillness does not become empty. It becomes crowded. It fills with words never spoken, with tenderness never received, with grief that has no clean occasion to declare itself. The world sees composure. Inside, pressure gathers. Perhaps Francesca learned quickly that there was little use in bringing delicacy to a place governed by utility. Perhaps she discovered that her husband's attention, when present at all, arrived burdened with preoccupation, authority, or impatience rather than warmth. Perhaps she understood, little by little, that whatever companionship marriage poets like to imagine was not going to emerge simply because vows had been made. Such realizations are rarely dramatic in the moment. They accumulate. One evening of coldness leads into another. One unanswered attempt at closeness is followed by caution, then withdrawal. Over time, disappointment hardens into atmosphere, and atmosphere shapes the soul as surely as event. We often imagine tragedy, beginning with the instant of transgression, with the fatal kiss, the discovered secret, the act that can be named and judged. But that is only the visible crest of a much deeper wave. The real beginning may lie far earlier, in the arrangement of a life where duty consumes tenderness, where a woman's inner world is treated as irrelevant, where all noble paths of emotional fulfillment are quietly blocked. Betrayal, when it comes, will carry moral consequence. But before betrayal there is deprivation. Before sin there is constriction. Before the fall there is a room with no window open to the heart. This does not absolve anyone. It clarifies the weather in which choices are made. To understand Francesca's marriage is to understand that her later vulnerability did not arise from idle caprice. It arose in a life tightly organized against intimacy, the honorable place in which love might have matured lawfully, gradually, and in peace had not been prepared for her. She had been given a husband, a title, a household, and duties. She had not necessarily been given companionship. She had not necessarily been given kindness. And without kindness, even the most legitimate bond can become spiritually desolate. Giovanni himself remains, in this sense, tragic as well, though in a different register, are often praised for the very qualities that make them dangerous within intimacy. They are rewarded for hardness, decisiveness, command, suspicion, control. Such traits may preserve a state or strengthen a family position, but the home is not a battlefield, and the soul beside them is not territory to be managed. If Giovanni could not recognize that, then he was not merely personally limited. He was the product of a world that taught men to rule before it taught them to love. Francesca would live with the consequences of that lesson, and so the marriage settles into its true shape. Not a partnership of equals, not a sanctuary, but an arrangement whose legitimacy only deepens its sadness. Because she cannot easily rebel, she must remain. Because she must remain, she must adapt. Because she must adapt, her silence grows skillful. She learns how to move through obligation with elegance. She learns how to keep pain from spilling into public view. She learns the discipline that noble women across centuries have been taught, to suffer in a way that does not inconvenience the order around them. Yet suffering, however graceful, does not lose its force. It waits, it listens, it becomes exquisitely sensitive to any sign of warmth. In a cold room, even a small fire seems immense. In a life governed by calculation, the smallest gesture of understanding can feel like rescue. The more Francesca's marriage denies the language of tenderness, the more powerful that language will become if she ever hears it spoken sincerely near her. That is why the tragedy ahead does not spring from nowhere. It grows in the shadowed spaces of this union, in the distance between what Francesca is asked to be and what she is still irreducibly human enough to need. She is not simply a wife within a political contract. She is a feeling creature enclosed within a form that does not know what to do with feeling. Day after day, the mismatch remains. Day after day, she carries herself with the dignity expected of her, while some essential part of her life remains unacknowledged. And once a person has lived too long in such unacknowledgement, recognition itself becomes perilous. Not because recognition is evil in its first movement, but because it arrives to a starved place. It meets a hunger that has been made more desperate by discipline, loneliness, and denied speech. What might have remained ordinary in another life becomes overwhelming in this one. Into that strained household, then, and into the silence Francesca has been forced to master, another presence will soon step, one whose warmth makes the coldness around her newly impossible to ignore. That presence was Paolo Malatesta. In the surviving memory of this story, his name often arrives already wrapped in desire, as if he were destined from the beginning to become the beautiful ruin at its center. But to understand the force of what happened, it matters to slow down and let him enter first as a man, not a symbol. He was Giovanni's brother, a member of the same powerful family that had absorbed Francesca into its web of alliances. He belonged to the world around her not as an interruption from outside, but as part of the structure of her new life. That is what makes his arrival so plausible and, in a deeper sense, so dangerous. He did not come crashing through the walls. He was already within them. Compared with Giovanni, Paolo seems in almost every retelling to carry an entirely different weather about him. Where Giovanni is remembered as severe, practical, marked by the hard outlines of war and rule, Paolo appears with ease in his bearing, with grace in his movements, with a kind of social warmth that draws people toward him before they have fully decided to trust him. Accounts across centuries have tended to preserve this contrast, because it is emotionally irresistible. One brother seems fitted to command obedience. The other seems capable of inspiring affection. One occupies space heavily. The other enters it lightly. Whether every detail was exactly so matters less than the truth the contrast reveals. Francesca's world had prepared her to endure authority, but not to defend herself against tenderness. Paolo was admired, and not only for his appearance, though that too became part of his legend. He was said to be handsome, refined, courtly in a way that mattered in aristocratic life, where gesture and tone were not small things, but signals of education, discipline, and value. He knew how to speak, he knew how to listen, he knew how to put others at ease. Such qualities can seem almost decorative when listed from a distance, but inside a house ruled by tension and obligation, they become transformative. A gentle word in the right place can feel like rescue. A patient silence can feel like shelter. A face that brightens at your presence can make you remember for the first time in months that you still exist as more than a role. It is not hard to imagine how Francesca first noticed the difference. Perhaps not in a thunderclap, not in a moment of cinematic certainty, but gradually, through the accumulated relief of contrast. Someone greets her and actually waits for her answer. Someone asks a question and does not turn away before she has spoken. Someone speaks to her not as a burden transferred, not as a duty completed, but as a person whose thoughts may be worth hearing. For a woman living under the weight of a marriage arranged for advantage, these are not trivial mercies. They are the first openings in a sealed room, and Paolo's place in the household orbit would have made such openings difficult to avoid. He was this distant stranger glimpsed once, and then transformed by fantasy. As a nobleman attached to family affairs, politics, diplomacy, and the ongoing business of alliance, he would have moved in and out of the same spaces, shared the same meals on certain occasions, appeared in the same halls, courtyards, chambers of discussion, and ceremonial moments that structured aristocratic life. The great families of the period did not live as modern people imagine, in sealed emotional compartments. Their domestic world and their political world overlapped constantly. Kin were also agents, brothers were also negotiators, esquires, witnesses. Proximity was part of the design. That repeated nearness matters. Tragedy does not always begin with a forbidden gesture. Often it begins with recurrence. A voice heard once can be dismissed. A kindness repeated begins to take root. A person encountered by chance remains a possibility. A person encountered again and again becomes a presence. Francesca would not have had to seek Paolo out in any dramatic way for him to become woven into the texture of her days. He could simply be there often enough that she began anticipating his arrival without admitting even to herself that she was doing so. Yet if he offered emotional relief, that did not make him free. It is tempting to flatten Paolo into the role of romantic ideal, to imagine him as all openness, all impulse, all soft rebellion against the harshness represented by Giovanni. But that simplification weakens the story instead of strengthening it. Paolo, too, was bound. He was a son and brother of a ruling house. His loyalties were not abstract. They were lived, enforced, inherited. He understood what family meant in a world where family was power, protection, and threat all at once. He would have known what was owed to his brother, what was expected of him in public conduct, what damage scandal could inflict not only on private lives but on political standing. He did not stand outside consequence. He stood in the middle of it. That awareness is part of what makes him human. If he had been careless from the first, if he had approached Francesca with the easy confidence of a man chasing pleasure, the emotional shape of the story would be different. But what lingers in the imagination is something more complicated. The sense that he, too, would have recognized the line before crossing it. He would have known there were topics safer than others, moments shorter than they wished, glances that must be cut off before someone noticed. He would have known how dangerous sympathy can become when two people are lonely in related ways. And perhaps he was lonely too, though not in the same form as Francesca. Charming men are often imagined as emotionally abundant, But charm can also be a discipline, even a mask. A man skilled in society may become the surface onto which everyone projects ease, while carrying his own strains inwardly and in silence. Paolo's obligations would have required diplomacy, self-command, and constant awareness of rank and appearance. If he was indeed more emotionally fluent than Giovanni, that fluency may have made him more vulnerable, not less. The person who notices another's sadness is rarely untouched by sadness himself. The one who can offer comfort usually understands the need for it. So when Francesca encountered Paolo, she may have found not simply beauty or excitement, but recognition shaped in a form she could receive. He did not need to flatter her extravagantly to affect her. He only needed to be attentive where others were dismissive, gentle where others were blunt, alive to nuance where others cared only for function. Trust does not begin in flame. It begins in safety. It begins when a person feels, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that their inner life will not be mishandled. This is essential to understand, because temptation in stories is too often told as if it springs fully formed from appetite alone. But in many real human lives, what is called temptation enters first as consolation. Francesca does not have to see Paolo immediately as the man she might love. It is enough that she sees him as the one person before whom she does not feel erased. It is enough that his presence softens the strain in her body. It is enough that conversation with him does not feel like labor. Before desire speaks, trust has already begun its quiet work. Perhaps there were moments small enough that no one else would have remembered them. A brief exchange during an evening gathering, where Paolo's wit lifted the heaviness of formal talk. A walk across a courtyard, in which he matched his pace to hers without making a display of concern. A glance of understanding when some harshness from Giovanni or another member of the household passed over her and had to be endured in silence. In rigid worlds, intimacy often grows not through grand declarations, but through these tiny acts of witness. To be seen at the instant one is trying hardest not to reveal pain can create a bond more powerful than deliberate seduction. And still, there would have been restraint. That too is part of the closeness. Paolo's danger lies not only in his appeal, but in the possibility that he did not exploit it openly. A man who keeps respectful distance can become more trusted than one who presses too near. A man who seems to govern himself appears safe. Francesca could believe herself secure with him, precisely because he did not immediately ask for anything. The emotional door opens most easily when no one seems to be forcing it. One can imagine her turning toward him first in the most innocent terms available to her own conscience. Here at last is someone kind. Here is someone educated enough to speak of poetry, memory, or the subtler shades of feeling. Here is someone whose company relieves the pressure of a life lived under constant watchfulness. There is no need at first to name this as danger. In fact, naming it too early would feel almost unjust. Because what has he done except be humane? What has she done except feel less alone? But that is exactly how moral peril enters many lives, not dressed as wickedness, dressed as mercy. For Paolo, the conflict would have sharpened with every repeated meeting. If he cared for Francesca even slightly, loyalty would not erase that care. It would make it harder to bear. The more admirable his impulses, the more impossible his position. To withdraw entirely might seem cold, even cruel, especially if he sensed how isolated she was. To remain near, offering harmless companionship, might seem manageable, perhaps even honorable. After all, a conversation is only a conversation. A shared laugh is only a moment. Concern need not become confession. But human hearts are not governed by the tidy categories that public life requires. Affection grows in the spaces where people tell themselves nothing irreversible is happening. And so Paolo stands at the threshold of the story, not merely as the beloved, but as the one whose very goodness complicates the moral field. If Giovanni had a cruel enemy, Francesca could oppose him inwardly with clarity. If a vulgar seducer approached her, she could recoil. But what defense exists against someone who seems, at least at first, to restore what one's life has been starving? What defense exists against a man who awakens not rebellion first, but relief? This is why Paolo matters before the romance ever declares itself. He changes the emotional scale of Francesca's world. Once she has experienced warmth, the cold no longer feels neutral. Once she has been answered with understanding, indifference becomes harder to bear. Once another human being has made room for her soul, the life that ignores that soul grows more painful by comparison. He does not create all her dissatisfaction. Much of it was already there, but he illuminates it. And illumination is rarely innocent when it falls upon a forbidden lack. In him, beauty and danger become inseparable, not because beauty is itself corrupt, but because beauty joined to kindness can bypass the defenses built against harsher threats. Paolo's grace, his manner, his emotional accessibility, these are not ornaments in the tale, they are causes. They explain why Francesca's heart would move before her judgment could fully forbid it. They explain why she might feel gratitude before longing, trust before desire, peace before fear. And they explain why he, too, could be drawn into a bond he may have told himself, in the beginning, he was strong enough to contain. What begins in contrast soon deepens into something more dangerous, because comfort has a way of becoming confession. A shared glance that once passed for simple courtesy begins to feel like something held privately between two people, rather than something offered freely to the world around them. At first, nothing visible changes, no declaration is made, no boundary is dramatically crossed. The world around them remains outwardly intact, ruled by the same duties, the same expectations, the same quiet surveillance of courtly life. Francesca is still a wife. Paolo is still a member of the family into which she has been placed. They still move within rooms where words are measured, where every gesture can be seen, where reputation is both armor and prison. And yet the true shifts in a life often happen where no one else is looking. They happen in tone, in timing, in the strange relief of being understood without asking. It may have begun in conversation so ordinary that neither of them could have named it as a beginning. A question asked with real attention, an answer that was listened to rather than merely received, a pause in which one did not hurry the other back into politeness. Francesca, in a world where she must often perform composure, would have felt the rarity of that almost immediately. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from being watched but not known, spoken to but not heard. When someone finally notices the thought behind the silence, the feeling can be startlingly intimate. Perhaps Paolo was simply kinder than others. Perhaps he was more at ease with gentleness, less armored by pride, less eager to dominate every exchange. He may have spoken to her not as a possession that had been won, nor as a political arrangement now completed, but as a person still vividly alive inside her role. That difference alone could change the atmosphere around her. A woman who has learned to keep herself hidden will feel, with almost painful clarity, the presence of anyone before whom concealment becomes harder. Their closeness, then, need not have risen from dramatic moments. It could have been built out of small mercies, a conversation extended beyond necessity, a walk in which neither was eager to return too soon, a fleeting look across a crowded hall that said, more clearly than speech, "I see what this costs you." Concern kept carefully within the limits of decorum, the offering of company without demand, the acceptance of silence without suspicion. Such things seem minor from the outside, but when a life is governed by restraint, the smallest tenderness can arrive with the force of revelation. Loneliness sharpens all feeling. It turns ordinary kindness into sustenance. It makes a thoughtful word feel like shelter. Francesca's marriage, however it functioned in the public eye, appears in the tradition of the story as emotionally barren, or at least incapable of meeting the inward hunger that defines her. She is bound, surrounded, positioned, and yet profoundly alone. In such a condition, a sympathetic presence does not remain merely pleasant for long. It begins to matter, then it begins to be awaited. Then, more dangerously still, it begins to be needed. That need likely announced itself to her before she was willing to interpret it. She may have noticed first that certain rooms felt easier when Paolo was in them, that the day altered in texture according to whether she expected to see him, that her thoughts, once disciplined toward endurance, had begun to anticipate one particular voice. It is one of the most unsettling experiences in human life, to discover that another person has quietly become part of one's emotional structure, not because one chose it deliberately, but because the heart, grateful for understanding, has already made a place. And Paolo, too, would not have been untouched by this gradual rearrangement. It is tempting, in retellings, to imagine one lover simply pursued and the other passively yielding, but stories of lasting tragedy are rarely so simple. He may have recognized in Francesca something that called out to what was best in him first. Her intelligence, her sensitivity, the dignity with which she carried a burden she had not chosen. Compassion can become attachment before it has time to examine itself. To care for another's sorrow is to let that sorrow enter one's own inner life. Once admitted there, it does not always remain under control. Their intimacy, if we can call it that before any open confession, likely depended on what remained unsaid as much as on what was spoken. There are relationships formed less by disclosure than by mutual recognition. A glance that lingers one heartbeat too long, a sentence broken off because both understand how it must end. A sudden caution in the presence of others, the instinctive turning toward each other in moments of tension, as if each has become the other's measure of safety. These are the grammar of feeling before language dares to name it. What makes this evolution so human is that it does not grow in innocence. Paolo and Francesca are not children wandering unknowingly toward danger. They are aware, perhaps not at the first tremor, but certainly before the feeling reaches its full strength, that what is awakening between them has consequence. That awareness does not stop love. If anything, it gives love its painful clarity. Every restrained word becomes more charged because it is restrained. Every act of care becomes morally weighty because it cannot pretend to be neutral. Their bond forms under the shadow of prohibition, and so conscience is present from the beginning, not after the fact. This matters. It matters because it changes the meaning of their tenderness. They do not step into feeling as though the world were empty of obligation. Francesca knows she's bound. Paolo knows what loyalty demands of him, not only as a man but as a brother, as someone embedded in a structure where honor is not a private matter. To feel drawn toward each other is already to feel the first pressure of guilt. Not guilt for an act completed, but guilt for a truth taking shape inside them that should not exist and yet does. Perhaps they resisted first, by naming their closeness as nothing unusual, by telling themselves that sympathy is not betrayal, that conversation is not desire, that concern can remain pure if carefully governed. And in one sense, this would not be false. Human beings often cross thresholds inwardly long before they can admit they are nearing them. We preserve ourselves with definitions. We say this is only friendship, only kindness, only understanding. But such words can become fragile shelters when the heart has begun to invest itself more deeply than language allows. There is also the possibility that what bound them most strongly was not passion in its immediate form, but recognition. The profound and almost frightening recognition of meeting someone who understands the self one has had to hide. Francesca, displaced by marriage and confined by role, may have felt in Paolo an answering loneliness, even if his condition was outwardly freer than hers. He may have sensed in her not merely beauty or melancholy, but a mind and spirit living under erasure. To be recognized at that depth is dangerous because it can feel less like temptation than like truth. And truth has a way of making duty feel unreal, even when duty remains terribly real in its consequences. This is why forbidden love so often grows not through excess, but through deprivation. It is not always born from abundance of pleasure. Sometimes it is born from famine. A starved life magnifies nourishment. A constrained soul clings to the first space in which it can breathe. For Francesca, whose world may have offered security without tenderness, position without companionship, the presence of one person who seemed to understand her inner weather could become indispensable. For Paolo, to find himself not simply admired but needed, not superficially welcomed but inwardly met, may have created a bond no reason could easily dismiss. And still, hesitation would remain. It would have to. There would be moments when one or both withdrew slightly, afraid of what had become visible. Moments when they spoke more formally than they wished. Moments when caution entered the room before they did. The very care they felt for each other might sharpen their fear, because to continue was to endanger not only themselves but the one they had come to cherish. Love under such conditions is never merely hunger. It is also restraint, shame, resistance, denial, and the repeated failure of denial. One can imagine Francesca asking herself whether she has mistaken gratitude for love, whether the relief of being treated with gentleness has made her vulnerable to illusion. Such doubts would be natural, even necessary. A morally serious heart does not rush to excuse itself. It interrogates its own longing. It asks whether loneliness has dressed need in the language of destiny. But perhaps what makes her bond with Paolo endure in memory is that it survives such interrogation. The feeling does not vanish when examined. It grows more painful but also more undeniable. Paolo, too, may have struggled to separate tenderness from transgression. To protect Francesca, he would have needed to resist the very impulse that bound him to her. To remain honorable, he would have had to become cold in ways that neither truth nor compassion could sustain for long. If he tried to keep distance, that very effort may have revealed to both of them how much was already at stake. Sometimes we only understand our attachment fully in the moment we attempt to sever it, and find we cannot do so without injury. So their love, if we follow it carefully, is not a sudden flame descending from nowhere. It is an accumulation, a dependence of feeling laid down layer by layer, shared time, shared attention, shared inwardness. The gradual certainty that one person has become the place where the self feels least alone. It is built out of repetition, out of the return to each other's presence, out of the confidence that each can entrust to the other what the world around them cannot safely hold. That is why it becomes so powerful. It does not rest only on desire. It rests on refuge. And refuge can become more perilous than desire, because desire may pass, but refuge alters the architecture of the heart. Once another person becomes the one before whom your loneliness relaxes, your silence softens, your hidden life dares to breathe, separation no longer feels like discipline. It feels like mutilation. That is the threshold they approach, not merely wanting each other, but needing the reality they become for each other. In a less cruel world, this meeting might have arrived early enough, freely enough, to become a blessing. Here it arrives too late, inside obligations already sealed, under conditions that make honesty itself a kind of danger. That is part of the tragedy people continue to feel in their story. Paolo and Francesca do not simply desire what they should not have. They discover each other in the wrong moral landscape. Their bond is neither innocent nor cynical. It is aware, it is conflicted. It is touched from the beginning by the knowledge that if spoken plainly, it could destroy lives. And yet not speaking plainly does not undo it. Silence only drives feeling inward where it gathers force. What cannot be confessed begins to live in gesture, in memory, in anticipation, in the ache of every leave-taking. By now, they are no longer merely companions in circumstance. They are becoming witnesses to each other's hidden selves. That is a deeper form of intimacy than any public closeness could offer. It means that each carries knowledge of the other that the world does not possess. It means that ordinary encounters are now charged by an inward history invisible to others. It means that when they speak, they are always speaking around something larger than the words. A bond like that can remain restrained for a time, but restraint does not diminish it. Often it deepens it. And so the movement from sympathy to love is not a fall all at once, but a series of inward permissions followed by inward alarms. To care, to trust, to wait for a presence, to miss it, to fear what that missing means, to deny it, to recognize it again, to understand finally that what has grown between two souls has grown under pressure, in consciousness and in sorrow. They have not wandered blindly into feeling. They have watched it form and feared it as it formed. Perhaps that is why, when the moment comes that exposes everything, it carries such devastating force. The heart has already traveled far before the world catches up. Yet even the most guarded hearts are changed by stories, and one shared reading will become the most remembered moment of their lives. Books were rarely considered dangerous objects within a noble household, watched as they were for scandal of a cruder kind, yet this single volume would prove itself the most perilous thing either of them had ever touched. It happens not on a battlefield, not in a court of public accusation, not under the violent gaze of fate announcing itself with thunder. It happens in stillness, in a room enclosed from the world, in the quiet intimacy of two people seated near one another, with a book between them and everything unspoken trembling just beneath the surface. That is part of why this scene has endured so powerfully across centuries. The catastrophe to come begins not with a cry, but with a page turning. They read together of Lancelot and Guinevere, another forbidden attachment, another love shadowed by danger, loyalty, and transgression. It is a tale already carrying the fragrance of courtly love, with all its beautiful contradictions, devotion ennobled by secrecy, desire clothed in refinement, longing made almost sacred by restraint. For listeners and readers of that world, such stories were not merely entertainment. They offered a language for feelings too delicate, too dangerous, or too disorderly to confess plainly. They taught lovers how to understand the ache of distance, the agony of silence, the sweetness and peril of admiration. They made emotion legible, and that is what gives this moment its piercing force. Paolo and Francesca do not sit down simply to pass time with a romance. They enter, perhaps without fully knowing it, a chamber of recognition. In the tale before them, they begin to see not only Lancelot and Guinevere, but themselves. Or rather, they begin to suspect that what has remained blurred and inward in their own hearts has already been lived, already been named, already been written by someone else. One can imagine the strange tenderness of that discovery, to feel something one has hardly dared to admit, then to encounter it in words, to hear desire described not as madness alone, but as devotion, not as vulgar appetite, but as trembling, exalted attachment. Literature in such a moment becomes more than narrative. It becomes a mirror. It gathers scattered feelings into a shape. It says this too exists. This too has been felt. You are not alone in it. That kind of recognition can be both comfort and danger. Perhaps they read slowly. Perhaps their voices, if they read aloud, were careful at first, almost formal, trying to preserve an ordinary distance. But stories have a way of narrowing space. Every line about concealed longing, every exchange of glances, every hesitation before surrender must have touched some living nerve between them. The room would not have changed, and yet everything in it would begin to feel altered, the air thicker, silence more charged, nearness less innocent. The genius and the cruelty of the scene lie here. The book does not create their love from nothing. It reveals what was already waiting. It gives contour to what had been gathering in fragments. Their private awakening is not born in imitation, as though they are merely acting out a romance they have borrowed. It is deeper than that. The story before them stirs what has already been ripening in secret. It gives their hearts a script, but the feeling itself has long been writing its own text in silence. Still, to receive language for desire is no small thing. Before words, feeling can remain suspended, half denied, easier to contain, because it has not yet been spoken even inwardly. But once named, it becomes harder to master. Once recognized, it asks to be answered. A truth glimpsed in literature may seem at first to stay safely behind the page, but often it crosses into life. It does not simply describe longing, it authorizes it, or seems to. And so the book becomes permission. Not formal permission, not moral innocence, not freedom from consequence, nothing so simple, but a subtler permission, the kind that enters through the imagination. If these lovers loved, if they trembled, if they yielded, then perhaps what Paolo and Francesca feel is not monstrous, not impossible, not wholly unspeakable. The story gives them a form in which their own emotion can appear less like chaos and more like destiny. It softens the boundary between thought and act. It suggests that to feel deeply is to belong to a noble tradition of suffering and devotion. Yet this is also how the book becomes a trap, because stories of courtly love are seductive precisely in the way they elevate desire. They wrap danger in beauty. They transform trespass into lyric feeling. They make the forbidden seem chosen by the soul itself. To readers already vulnerable, such stories do not merely reflect emotion. They intensify it. They place a shining veil over consequences. They encourage the heart to imagine that because a feeling is profound, it must also be right, or at least irresistible. Paolo and Francesca are not fools. That is important to remember. The tragedy of this moment does not depend on their ignorance. It depends on their consciousness. They know enough to fear what they feel. They know enough to hesitate. That hesitation is part of the scene's sorrow. They are not rushing blindly toward pleasure. They are sitting at the edge of a threshold, aware that crossing it will change everything, and unable to retreat into the innocence that existed before the reading began. Then comes the passage that will live forever in memory, the moment when Lancelot kisses Guinevere. How many times have readers throughout history paused there? How many have sensed, even before the words continue, that something irreversible is about to happen not only in the story, but in the room where Paolo and Francesca sit? The kiss in the book is not merely an event inside a distant romance. It becomes an invitation, an image too vivid to remain contained. The lovers before the page meet the lovers within it, and the distance between fiction and life collapses. Francesca will later say that they read no further. That detail is devastating. It tells us that the book reaches its true climax, not in what happens to Lancelot and Guinevere, but in what it awakens in its readers. Reading ceases because the story has done its work. The page no longer holds the feeling at a safe remove. What had been mediated through words now presses forward into the body, into breath, into trembling nearness. And then Paolo kisses her. The moment is often remembered for its scandal, for the sin that tradition will place upon it, for the judgment that follows. But if we linger inside the human truth of it, what first appears is tenderness, not triumph, not conquest, not some loud or fevered claim, rather the breaking of a long restraint, the answer to a silence that has become too full to bear, a kiss shaped by fear, longing, and a kind of sorrow even as it begins. Because somewhere inside the sweetness, there must also be the knowledge that this cannot be undone. That is why the kiss matters so profoundly. It is not only an expression of love, it is the instant when longing becomes deed. Until that point, everything could still be described as inward conflict, emotional closeness, dangerous sympathy, unspoken desire. But a kiss is different. A kiss enters history. It turns feeling into action. It gives the soul's secret a physical form. However brief, however gentle, it marks a crossing. And crossings are rarely dramatic in the instant themselves. Sometimes they are almost soft. The world does not split open. No bell sounds. No witness steps forward. There is only the closeness of two faces, the surrender of one hesitation after another, and then the contact itself, simple, intimate, irrevocable. Yet in that softness lies the full weight of catastrophe. Because once the boundary has been crossed, the old life cannot be restored by wishing. The tenderness of the kiss is inseparable from its danger. That is what makes it so tragic and so unforgettable. If it were merely reckless, it would be easier to judge and easier to leave behind. But it is not reckless in that shallow sense. It is aching, human, almost unbearably understandable. Two people who have suffered their feelings in silence find, for one suspended instant, release. The heart that has been denied speaks at last in the oldest language there is, closeness freely given and received. And still, that release is also a sealing. A story of love has given them language for connection, yet that very language ushers them toward ruin. The book that seemed to offer recognition also becomes an accomplice. In Francesca's famous remembrance, even the one who wrote the tale and the one who served as intermediary within it seem charged with responsibility, as if literature itself had acted upon them. This is not merely blame cast outward to escape guilt. It is a profound acknowledgement of how powerfully stories move within us. They do not remain inert. They shape desire, imagination, expectation. They can console, illuminate, and dignify. But they can also persuade us to step into what we only feared before. There is a tragic irony here that gives the scene its lasting radiance. What they find in the book is not deception in the crude sense. The tenderness is real. The recognition is real. The kiss is not false because it was anticipated by literature. If anything, the story helps reveal the truth of their attachment. And yet the truth it reveals is one the world will not permit. So the same act that brings them into a moment of perfect mutual understanding also binds them more tightly to disaster. The book becomes at once a lamp and a snare. That is why this scene stands at the emotional center of their legend. Everything before it gathers toward possibility. Everything after it bears the weight of fulfillment and consequence. Before the kiss, there is longing, however intense, still struggling to remain unnamed or untouched. After the kiss, love no longer lives only as potential. It has entered time, it has chosen its form, however, tenderly, it has declared itself against the order surrounding it. In that sense, the reading scene is not a decorative episode added to heighten romance. It is the revelation of the whole tragedy in miniature. Here are desire and fear seated side by side. Here is art giving voice to life, and life answering back too quickly. Here is beauty serving as both solace and temptation. Here is human vulnerability at its most intimate. Two people seeking understanding and finding, in the same gesture, both communion and doom. Perhaps that is why generations continue to return to this image of the open book, the shared reading, the fateful kiss. It captures something universal and deeply unsettling. We all know that stories shape us. We know what it is to find ourselves in another's words and to feel, suddenly, less alone. We know the relief of recognition. But this scene asks a darker question as well. What happens when the story that helps us understand our hearts also emboldens them past the point of safety? What happens when beauty does not merely reflect desire, but ripens it into action? For Paolo and Francesca, the answer arrives in a single kiss, gentle as breath and heavy as destiny. The page has turned, and with it their lives. Nothing outward may yet have shattered, but inwardly the line has been crossed. They have stepped from yearning into act, from imagined possibility into lived transgression. Love, once sheltered in silence, has found its form. And once desire has taken form, secrecy becomes its shelter and its torment. What hides a secret also isolates the ones keeping it, drawing them closer to one another, even as it cuts them further away from everyone else who once knew them well. From that moment on, nothing in the household could remain simple. The same corridors they had walked 100 times before now seemed altered, charged by memory, alive with risk. A doorway was no longer merely a doorway. A chamber was no longer only a room. The air itself seemed to listen. In a noble house where duties were fixed, where servants moved quietly, but saw more than they were meant to see, where kinship, rank and ritual ordered the day, privacy was fragile even for the innocent. For the guilty, it was almost unimaginable, and yet they had to go on living as though nothing had changed. That was perhaps the first cruelty of their hidden love. It did not free them from the ordinary world. It forced them deeper into it. Meals still had to be shared. Greetings still had to be spoken. Faces had to remain composed beneath the gaze of others. Francesca still belonged outwardly to the life she had been given, to the marriage that bound her name and body to another man, to the expectations placed upon a noble woman whose conduct reflected not only herself but an entire house. Paolo, too, had his place, his obligations, his loyalty to family, his duties as brother, son, emissary, man of honor. Neither could escape the shape of the world around them. They could only attempt with trembling care to create a secret space within it, so their love learned to survive in fragments. A glance held one heartbeat too long across a hall where others were speaking. A pause at the end of a sentence, weighted with more feeling than words could safely bear. The passing touch of a hand receiving a letter, a cup, a folded cloth, the nearness of one another at Vespers, where sacred words rose into the air, while their own forbidden longing burned in silence beneath them. Every small gesture became immense. Every silence deepened. What would have been little, under the sunlit freedom of a lawful love, became everything under concealment. Perhaps that is why hidden love can feel so absolute. Denied a place in ordinary life, it pours all its force into moments. It cannot grow openly through shared routines, through the slow weaving of common days, through the harmless intimacy of being seen together. Instead, it gathers itself in scarcity. It sharpens, it intensifies. What is withheld acquires radiance. What is forbidden begins to seem not merely desired, but fated. The lover is no longer simply beloved. He becomes necessary, because each encounter must carry the weight of all that cannot be lived elsewhere. For Francesca, this must have been both ecstasy and affliction. She had awakened into a feeling that answered something deep within her, something perhaps lonely and long denied. In Paolo she had found tenderness, understanding, and that dangerous sweetness of being fully recognized. He was not simply a handsome man or a flattering companion. He was the one who had reached the hidden chamber of her heart and found it already waiting for him. That kind of discovery can feel holy even when one knows it is condemned, perhaps especially then. But holiness and guilt can dwell terribly close together. She would have felt it in the chapel, where the stillness invited the soul to speak honestly. She would have felt it at night, when the house grew quiet, and there was no conversation to distract her from the sound of her own conscience. She would have thought of vows, of sacrament, of sin named plainly before God. She would have thought of the order of the world she had broken, and of the man to whom she was bound, whether or not affection had ever softened that bond. She would have known that desire did not erase consequence, and that sincerity did not make transgression innocent. That is one of the most painful truths in their story. Their love does not live in a realm beyond morality. They are not untouched by what they have done. They know, they understand. They do not step blindly into betrayal as though no one will be wounded by it. Their tenderness is inseparable from the knowledge that it comes at a cost. They are moved not only by longing, but by shame. And Paolo, for all his courage, cannot have been spared that torment. Whatever his heart urged him toward, he remained a brother. He remained part of a family in which loyalty was not abstract but sacred, woven into identity itself. To love Francesca was not merely to desire what was forbidden in a general sense. It was to trespass within the intimate structure of kinship and trust. Every moment he stole with her would have carried the sting of that truth. Every time he stood before his brother, every time he fulfilled some ordinary duty by day, after having surrendered to passion in secret, the division inside him must have widened. This is where the hidden phase of their love becomes so human and so difficult to judge from a distance. It is easy to imagine forbidden love as all fire, all abandon, all intoxication. But most such love is lived in intervals of fear. It is interrupted by footsteps in the corridor. It is shadowed by the possibility of a servant entering unannounced, of a letter misplaced, of a rumor born from nothing more than a change in the tone of two voices. It is not sustained by romance alone, but by nerves, calculation, waiting, and restraint. Lovers become watchful creatures. They listen for hinges, for names spoken unexpectedly, for the shift in mood that means suspicion has entered the room. In a noble household, where every movement leaves a trace, danger would have felt endlessly near. Someone always knew who had gone where. Someone noticed who lingered too long near the garden loggia, who sought excuses to remain after others had withdrawn, who seemed absent-minded at table, who grew flushed at the mention of a certain name. Aristocratic life, for all its ceremony, offered little anonymity. People lived among witnesses. Servants dressed them, attended their meals, carried messages, tended fires, made beds, opened shutters, closed doors. Silence was not emptiness, it was populated, and so Paolo and Francesca would have had to become fluent in concealment. They would have learned caution the way others learn prayer, through repetition and necessity. Perhaps they avoided each other for days at a time, so that no pattern could be seen. Perhaps one harsh word was spoken in public to disguise a tenderness hidden elsewhere. Perhaps messages were entrusted to no one, and memory became safer than ink. Perhaps an entire week's hope had to be compressed into a single brief encounter in a deserted passage, where one whispered exchange was enough to sustain them and destroy them at once. There is sweetness in imagining those stolen moments, but there is sorrow there too, because what they are stealing is not only time from others, they are stealing from themselves. They cannot let love unfold honestly. They cannot ask simple questions in open air. They cannot build a future with ordinary speech. Every joy arrives broken by the fact that it must be concealed. Every reunion already contains the pain of parting. Even while they are together, they are haunted by the knowledge that they cannot remain so. This may be why secret love often feels more intense than love permitted by the world. It is not necessarily purer, but it is concentrated. It lives under pressure. It has no room for carelessness. It cannot take presence for granted. A meeting that lasts only moments may be remembered for years, because each second is wrested from danger. A whispered word may linger more deeply than 100 declarations spoken without fear. The very impossibility of daylight grants the hidden hour a strange perfection. The lovers see one another, not amid the clutter of ordinary life, but through the clarifying lens of deprivation. Yet what appears perfect in such light may also become perilous, because secrecy does not only protect love, it magnifies it. It seals the lovers inside a world of two, where external voices grow faint and inward conviction grows strong. The more excluded they are from legitimacy, the more they may come to believe that what they feel must be larger than law, larger than custom, larger even than the lives already bound to theirs. If the world says no, the heart begins to answer with a fiercer yes. Opposition becomes proof. Suffering becomes evidence of depth, and little by little, the impossible starts to feel not merely worth the cost, but worth everything. Francesca may have told herself that such feeling could not be false if it wounded so deeply. Paolo may have believed that what was so tender could not be wholly corrupt, and in one sense, they would not be wrong. The tenderness is real. The recognition is real. The ache is real. Nothing is made less tragic by being insincere. Their love endures in memory precisely because it is not cold appetite, not convenience, not vanity alone, but a bond felt with devastating earnestness. Still, earnestness offers no immunity from ruin. One can imagine the strange rhythm of their days, moments of ordinary conversation with others, then inward surges of longing, hours of separation, then one brief meeting that turns the entire world vivid. Guilt in the morning, desire by evening, resolve one day, surrender the next. Perhaps more than once they tried to end it. Perhaps they spoke of honor, of repentance, of the impossibility of continuing. Perhaps they promised distance and believed themselves capable of it. But hidden love often feeds on renunciation. To say farewell while both hearts still burn is only to make the next reunion more dangerous. And tenderness, in such a condition, becomes almost unbearable. It is one thing to resist temptation that feels coarse or selfish. It is far harder to resist what feels gentle, mutual, deeply consoling. A hand held fear, a look of concern, a word spoken with kindness, when the rest of the world demands composure. These things can draw people across boundaries more powerfully than seduction ever could. Their love was not sustained by reckless appetite alone, but by comfort. Each became for the other the place where truth could be breathed. That is why secrecy bound them so tightly. In hiding their love from the world, they also made one another the sole witness of its reality. But to be each other's refuge is a dangerous blessing when the refuge cannot last. Even in happiness, they must have sensed this. Not always clearly, perhaps. Human beings are skilled at postponing the future when the present is too precious to surrender. Yet somewhere beneath the sweetness, there would have been a tremor, a constant awareness that they were living on borrowed time. Such loves often carry their own omen. The very care with which they are concealed reveals how much there is to lose. Every safe meeting confirms that safety is fragile. Every escape from suspicion reminds the heart that suspicion may already be forming somewhere out of sight. And so joy itself becomes sharpened by foreknowledge. A smile is brighter because it may be the last one exchanged in peace. An embrace is more desperate because part of the soul already fears interruption. Even laughter can sound different when danger stands just outside the door. They were not wandering in a garden untouched by history. They were moving through a house full of claims upon them, familial, political, moral, sacred. Their love did not float above those claims. It defied them, and therefore had to tremble beneath them. There is something profoundly sad in that image, two people discovering in each other what feels most alive and most true, while also knowing that the form their happiness has taken cannot endure. They cannot bring it into the open and expect blessing. They cannot transform it into an accepted life. At best, they can prolong it. At worst, they can only deepen the wound from which neither will emerge untouched. Perhaps this is why their story lingers with such force across centuries. Not because many of us will face the exact architecture of their peril, but because we understand the ache of wanting what cannot be kept. We understand how secrecy can make feeling feel larger, how guilt can coexist with sincerity, how joy can be haunted from within. We know what it is to sense, even at the height of tenderness, that time is not on our side. And in stories such as theirs, borrowed time always ends with discovery. No secret endures forever inside a household built on watchfulness and rumor. And theirs, however carefully guarded, would prove no exception to that old and merciless rule. It rarely arrives all at once. More often, it gathers at the edges first, in glances that linger too long, in silences that suddenly feel arranged, in the faint but unmistakable change in the air around two people who are trying too carefully not to be seen. A hidden love does not remain hidden only because lovers are discreet. It survives, if it survives at all, because the world around them chooses not to notice, or notices and says nothing. But that kind of mercy is fragile. It can be broken by boredom, by accident, by a servant's observation, by a brother's intuition, by the simple truth that passion unsettles everything it touches. For Paolo and Francesca, secrecy could never become safety. The very intensity that drew them together also made concealment harder. Love changes the face, the voice, the body's rhythm. It teaches waiting, and waiting is visible. It teaches alertness to another's presence, and that too can be seen. A room changes when one person enters, and another feels it before anyone has spoken. Even restraint has a temperature. Even caution leaves traces. In a noble household, where movements were watched and hierarchy shaped every encounter, privacy itself was a luxury. Doors opened without warning. Messages passed through many hands. Meals, visits, ceremonies, and obligations placed bodies in one another's path, while at the same time making true solitude nearly impossible. And because everyone understood the value attached to lineage, alliance, and marital obedience, everyone also understood the danger of transgression. In such a world, rumor was not merely idle talk. It was a force. It traveled ahead of proof. It sharpened uncertainty into suspicion, and suspicion into action. We cannot know each detail of how tension closed around them, but the logic is easy to imagine. Perhaps there were servants who exchanged looks after Paolo had left a chamber too quickly. Perhaps Francesca's composure failed at the wrong moment, and someone with a practiced eye noticed. Perhaps Giovanni, already a man who knew the world through injury and vigilance, had begun to read every gesture against the possibility of mockery. Honor cultures are built on the terror of being made small before others. They teach men to hear insult in whispers, to fear laughter they cannot control, to treat a wife not as an inner life, but as a sign of their authority. Under such conditions, jealousy is never only personal, it is social, it is political, it is public before it is intimate. And so the lovers, who may once have believed their secret could be managed, would have felt the pressure changing. Moments that once felt daring begin to feel dangerous. The space between longing and fear narrows. A delayed footstep in the corridor can stop the breath. A knock at the door can summon panic before thought. Every meeting can divert it against itself. Joy, because the beloved is near. Dread, because this may be the last time. In strain, because the body cannot remain forever in that state of alert tenderness without beginning to fray. There is a cruelty in that final phase of concealment. Love, already impossible, becomes haunted by its own exposure. The lovers are no longer only protecting each other from pain. They are protecting themselves from the structure waiting to crush them. They know, if not in words then in instinct, that they are not dealing merely with a husband's anger. They are standing beneath a whole architecture of rights and punishments, one that gives sanctioned violence to wounded male possession. Their affection may be private, but the consequences of it will not be. This is why the scene of discovery matters so deeply in the story that follows. It is not simply the moment when a secret is found out. It is the moment when one world collides with another. On one side, the hidden space they made between them, fragile, human, tender, forbidden. On the other, the external order that insists bodies belong where power has placed them, that marriage is contract before companionship, and that female desire, once detached from its assigned duty, becomes a provocation to be answered. Tradition places the discovery in an enclosed room, an interior made intimate by reading, by nearness, by the suspended softness of shared attention. However the moment unfolded in fact or legend, what matters is the shock of interruption. One instant belongs to them alone. The next does not belong to them at all. Perhaps there was first the sound. A door moved too sharply. a step where no step should have been. Perhaps Francesca turned before Paolo did. Perhaps the blood left her face at once, because women in such stories often understand danger a fraction sooner, having lived more closely with the consequences of male wrath. Perhaps Paolo, in that terrible second, thought not of himself but of her. We imagine people in moments like these as grand and eloquent, but real terror is usually smaller, quicker, more bodily. The heart strikes hard against the ribs. The mouth dries. The world narrows to a few unbearable facts. He is here, he knows, there is no time. Giovanni's entrance into that secret space has often been remembered in the language of violence. But before violence there is recognition, and recognition itself is devastating. To see with one's own eyes what one has feared or suspected is to feel the mind split. Suspicion still leaves room for denial. Discovery removes it. Whatever half-formed stories he may have told himself before that instant collapse under the evidence of presence, posture, proximity, and expression. There they are, not accused, not rumored, not imagined there. For Francesca, the shock is doubled. She is not only seen by her husband, she is translated in an instant from person to offense. Whatever tenderness she had been living inside is stripped of its inward truth and rendered, before the law of the household, as betrayal. Her fear would not have been abstract. She would have known what men could do and what society would permit them to do. She would have known that pleading might fail before it even began, because this was not a dispute between equals. This was judgment descending from above, armed with custom and entitlement. And Paolo, whether he moved to shield her, whether he reached for words, whether he froze in disbelief, stands in a position equally impossible. Brother, lover, intruder, traitor. All the names crash together. In another moral universe, his feeling might be tragic, sinful, misguided, even forgivable. In this one, it becomes an assault on male sovereignty. He has not only loved where he should not, he has crossed into the field of possession. He has violated bonds that the surrounding culture treats as foundational. It is not merely that Giovanni has been hurt. It is that Giovanni has been dishonored, and dishonor in such a world demands a performance of correction. That brutal logic can be difficult for modern hearts to inhabit, because we are inclined to ask first what was felt. Did Giovanni ever care for Francesca? Was he cold by nature, or merely formed by his age? Did betrayal wound him because he loved, or because he believed himself entitled? The answer may be some mix of all these things, but the structure around him matters more than his private complexity. Men were taught to understand women's bodies as extensions of household power, marriage as a political instrument, and violated fidelity as an injury to status that could not simply be endured. To forgive too easily was to risk becoming ridiculous. To hesitate was to appear weak, and weakness, especially in a nobleman, could be more feared than cruelty. So his reaction, however swift, belongs not only to temperament but to system. Rage rushes in, but rage is given a script. The script says that a husband wronged is authorized to avenge. The script says that blood restores what humiliation has broken. The script says that the man who has been made a spectacle must answer with force so decisive that no one will dare read him as diminished. In that sense, the tragedy is larger than three hearts. It is cultural before it is personal. What follows happens with the terrible speed common to irreversible acts. There is no long tribunal, no patient sorting of motives, no room in which feeling can explain itself. A private attachment, however deep, crashes instantly into public meaning. The room that a moment before held breath, warmth, and dangerous tenderness becomes a place of accusation and mortal fear. The lovers have no time to turn their story into language. They are seized by someone else's language first. Adultery, betrayal, shame, vengeance. And because violence in these stories is often remembered in blunt outline, we should resist the temptation to make it cinematic. The horror lies not in spectacle, but in intimacy undone. The same bodies that leaned close in trust are suddenly thrown into extremity. The same hands that turned pages together may reach now in reflex, defense, desperation. There is pleading, perhaps. There is panic, certainly. There is the sickening knowledge that the future has vanished in a single instant. Whatever words were spoken, if any were spoken, they would have drowned beneath the force of what had already been decided. This is the point at which many retellings make the lovers seem doomed by love itself, as though desire were a self-contained curse that naturally burns toward death. But that is too easy, and it lets the surrounding world escape responsibility. Paolo and Francesca are not destroyed simply because they felt too much. They are destroyed because feeling took shape in a social order built on ownership, surveillance, and retaliatory honor. They are destroyed because a woman's marriage could bind her regardless of consent, because a husband's claim could outrank a wife's inner life, because masculine pride could call homicide justice. Love may have opened the door to risk, but power was what walked through it armed. To say this does not erase their choices. They chose each other within the narrow and dangerous space available to them. They crossed lines they understood. They accepted, at least in part, the peril of what they were doing. Yet choice inside coercive structures is never simple freedom. Their longing emerged in a world that had already arranged their bodies and futures according to interests beyond their own. The crime, if we must use that word, did not occur on equal ground. Giovanni possessed legal and social force. They possessed secrecy. And secrecy is a frail weapon against authority once discovered. That imbalance is what makes the end feel so devastating. Not because two lovers were careless, but because the private truth they had found in one another was always living on borrowed permission from a world that had no intention of granting it dignity. The instant they were seen, they ceased to be souls in relation and became examples. Their punishment would speak beyond them. It would restore order, display control, and warn others what happens when desire refuses the boundaries power has drawn. And so their earthly story closes not in reconciliation, not in understanding, but in blood. The chamber that sheltered their hidden tenderness becomes the site of its destruction. Whatever life they imagined beyond the next hour is cut away. No appeal can outpace the blade of honor once it has been unsheathed. In the end, what kills them is not only jealousy, nor only betrayal, nor only the dangerous sweetness of a love that should never have been possible. It is the world that made tenderness a trespass and vengeance a duty. Their earthly story ends in blood, but that is not where memory leaves them. Their earthly story ends in blood, but blood is never the end of a story like this. After the fatal moment, what remains is something colder and harder to contain. The stunned stillness that follows violence. The breathless silence of a room that has witnessed too much. The unbearable knowledge that what was hidden has now been exposed in the most absolute way possible. Two living bodies, once bound by secrecy, longing and trembling hope, are reduced to evidence. Love, which had lived in whispers and glances, is dragged into the open by death. There is a special horror in such an ending because it seals what life had left unresolved. Paolo and Francesca are not parted by time, nor by fading affection, nor by a gradual surrender to duty. They are stopped all at once, struck in the middle of feeling, before anything could settle into repentance, escape, forgiveness, or even full despair. Their love had no lawful future in the world they inhabited. No blessing could protect it. No institution could absorb it without naming it a crime. And so the violence that kills them does more than end their lives. It declares with brutal finality that this love was never going to be permitted a place among the living. Yet even that declaration cannot fully master what happened. Murder can silence voices, but it cannot command meaning. The blow that cuts down two lovers may satisfy rage or restore offended honor in the eyes of society, but it does not answer the deeper human questions left behind. What exactly has been destroyed? Sin or tenderness? Corruption or companionship? Weakness or one of the few true feelings in a world arranged around alliance and force? The dead do not rise to explain themselves, and because they cannot, those who remain begin the work that communities always do around tragedy. They speak, they judge, they embellish, they condemn, they pity. In the immediate aftermath, there would have been shock before there was interpretation. The first response to such a scene is not philosophy but recoil. The bodies, the blood, the recognition of faces once familiar, now emptied of motion. The collapse of ordinary sound into a silence so complete that even footsteps seem indecent. Whatever anger had led to the act, whatever certainty had been claimed in its approach, the finished deed would carry its own terrible weight. Violence once imagined may look righteous to those who prepare it. Violence once completed often leaves behind a silence too grave for triumph. And then, slowly, the silence fills. Servants notice what has changed. Family members hear fragments before they hear facts. Doors open close and open again. Someone asks where they are. Someone already knows. Rumor begins in the hushed language of those who believe they are preserving discretion. And, within hours, discretion becomes scandal. A secret love hidden behind walls now belongs to corridors, kitchens, courtyards, and public memory. The private chamber gives way to the social world, and the social world is merciless. It does not preserve the texture of feeling. It preserves the outline of offense. This is how intimate suffering becomes communal property. Names once spoken within a family are repeated by strangers. People who never saw the lovers together begin to tell the story as if they had stood beside them. Motives harden. Scenes acquire convenient details. Sympathy and condemnation divide along familiar lines. Some would have seen in Francesca only a faithless wife, in Paolo only a betrayer of kin and bond. Others would have felt the pull of a more painful recognition. That affection can arise where it should not. That lives arranged by power often leave the heart no honorable place to go. That guilt and misery are not always opposites. What is most tragic is that death, which seems so final, resolves almost nothing. It ends breath, but it does not settle interpretation. If anything, it intensifies it. While they lived, Paolo and Francesca could still be imagined in relation to possible futures. They might flee. They might be forgiven. They might separate. They might repent. They might continue in fear until discovery. Once dead, they pass beyond action and enter symbol. And symbols are fought over more fiercely than living people, because symbols can be bent to serve the needs of everyone who claims them. For some, their deaths would have stood as a necessary correction, a violent but comprehensible restoration of moral order. In that view, the lovers are not tragic so much as cautionary. They crossed a forbidden threshold, and the punishment that followed merely completed a logic already present from the beginning. Desire led to betrayal. Betrayal led to blood. Such tellings leave little room for tears. They insist that pity is dangerous because pity softens law, and once law is softened, the whole structure trembles. But human feeling does not submit so easily to stern conclusions. Even those who believe the lovers sinned may hesitate before the image of two people killed together for having loved where they should not. There is something in the heart that resists pure judgment when confronted with vulnerability, beauty, fear, and helplessness. We may condemn an act and still grieve the people. We may affirm a code and still be pierced by the suffering required to uphold it. This tension is part of why Paolo and Francesca refuse to disappear into a single moral lesson. Their story does not let us remain comfortably severe. Francesca especially stands at the center of this unease. As a woman given in marriage for reasons beyond love, surrounded by expectations she did not design, she invites not excuse exactly, but understanding. Paolo, too, cannot be reduced to a simple figure of seduction or treachery. However one judges him, he is not merely an intruder into another man's marriage. He is also a man caught in the fatal convergence of desire, proximity, and emotional recognition. Together they inhabit that tragic territory where responsibility exists, but innocence has not wholly vanished. That is why their story aches. It asks not whether they were blameless, but whether blame is enough to explain them. After death, then, their love becomes something stranger than a secret affair and more enduring than a family disgrace. It becomes a question about the limits of moral law, a question about whether intention matters when set against consequence, a question about the difference between lust and love, between weakness and devotion, between the heat of passion and the deep surrender of the soul. Above all, it becomes a question about pity itself. When we hear of them, what are we being asked to feel? Outrage, sorrow, warning, recognition, perhaps all of these at once. That layered response is what keeps their memory alive when so many other violent medieval deaths have fallen into obscurity. Countless unions were political, countless jealousies were bloody, countless women were traded, and countless men enforced the hard logic of honor. Yet not every death enters the imagination with this peculiar force. Paolo and Francesca remain because the emotional shape of their story touches something that history alone cannot contain. It is not only what happened, but the unresolved human cry inside what happened that carries them forward. That cry is unfinished because death interrupts before confession can become explanation. We do not hear a final defense. We do not receive a clean statement of motives purified by hindsight. There is no peaceful closing scene in which each life is interpreted and assigned a stable meaning. Instead, there is rupture. There is a severing so abrupt that listeners across centuries instinctively lean closer, as if by listening more carefully, they might recover the lost final words. The silence after the murder almost becomes part of the story itself. It is the silence into which every later voice will speak. History, of course, can offer names, alliances, probable settings, and political context. Legend can add gesture, expression, and dramatic contour. Between them, a recognizable tale emerges. A marriage arranged, a bond formed elsewhere, discovery, vengeance, death. But neither history nor legend completely exhausts what Paolo and Francesca become. Facts can tell us that they died. Anecdote can tell us how they may have been found. Neither alone can explain why their sorrow continues to move hearts, long after the houses and quarrels that produced it have turned to dust. What happens next is one of the most remarkable transformations in literary memory. A story rooted in a local world of noble families, private chambers, and feudal expectations begins to loosen from those confines. The lovers are no longer only themselves. They begin to stand for something larger. The perilous intimacy between reading and desire, the conflict between social order and inward truth, the mystery of why certain forbidden loves seem to reveal the deepest tenderness precisely when they are doomed. Their deaths become not a conclusion, but a threshold. At that threshold, judgment becomes more complex, not less. Once a story leaves the courtroom of immediate scandal and enters the imagination, it acquires a second life. In that second life, punishment may still exist, but so does compassion. Moral categories remain, yet they are troubled by tears. The listener is no longer asked only to decide whether the lovers were wrong. The listener is asked to dwell in the painful space where wrong and human are inseparable. That space is difficult. It is also where art begins, and art is what will rescue Paolo and Francesca from mere disappearance, though not from suffering. They will not be saved into happiness. They will be saved into remembrance. Their names will pass beyond the households that feared them and the gossips who repeated them. Their embrace, broken in life, will be imagined again in another realm. Their voices, silenced by violence, will be heard through another voice, capable of carrying both judgment and pity together without dissolving either one. This matters because the deepest afterlife of some lives is not genealogical but poetic. Not everyone leaves descendants of the body. Some leave descendants of feeling. Paolo and Francesca belong to that second lineage. Their deaths did not preserve a bloodline. They preserved an emotion under pressure so intense that later generations could not look away from it. The world that destroyed them tried to define them through transgression alone. Memory refused to be so narrow. It kept hearing, beneath the scandal, the tremor of two souls who had recognized each other too late and at too great a cost. So when we stand at the edge of their murder and ask what remains, the answer is not peace. It is not certainty. It is not even justice in any simple sense. What remains is a wound in narrative form, a sorrow that insists on being revisited because no verdict has ever fully closed it. Were they sinners? Yes, perhaps undeniably. Were they victims? Also yes, in ways that disturb any easy judgment. Were they foolish? Certainly. Were they deeply, fatefully human? More than anything, and that is why the story does not end where their hearts stop. Death seals their earthly fate, but it does not settle their meaning. Instead, it releases them into a larger tribunal, one not governed only by law or family honor, but by imagination, conscience, and grief. There, they will no longer belong solely to the history that produced them. They will enter a vision vast enough to hold punishment and longing in the same breath. It is in the afterlife imagined by a poet that Paolo and Francesca become unforgettable. It is there, in Dante's Inferno, that their names pass out of chronicle and into eternity. Not eternity as peace, not eternity as reunion fulfilled, but eternity as motion without rest, desire without shelter, memory without relief. Dante does not place them among the monsters or the traitors or the cold-hearted. He finds them in the second circle of hell, in the place reserved for the lustful, where souls who surrendered reason to appetite are seized forever by a violent, ceaseless wind. The punishment is terrible, not because it burns, but because it never stops. It is weather turned into judgment, passion translated into climate. The scene is one of the most haunting in all of literature, because it feels both grand and intimate at once. Hell, in this circle, is not made of walls and chains so much as of force. The air itself has become their sentence. A black storm roars through the darkness, hurling souls in all directions, lifting them, driving them, sweeping them onward before they can choose a path or find stillness. Dante compares them to birds carried in winter skies, flocks blown helplessly by a merciless current. The image matters. These are not souls marching with pride toward their fate. They are carried. They are mastered by what once mastered them. The gusts outside them mirror the gusts within them, the old momentum of longing that in life overcame restraint, wisdom, and duty. In Dante's moral universe, this is no accidental symbolism. Sin is not only punished, it is revealed. The shape of the suffering exposes the shape of the desire. Those who in life allowed themselves to be swept away by passion are now literally swept forever through the air, never rooted, never settled, never whole. What they chose as sweetness has become instability. What felt like surrender to love has become surrender without end. The wind is more than torment. It is interpretation. It tells us how Dante understands them, not as creatures of evil calculation, but as souls who let emotion outrun judgment until it claimed the whole direction of their lives. And yet, among the many shades caught in that tempest, Paolo and Francesca are not lost in anonymity. Dante sees them together, moving through the storm side by side, as though even hell cannot separate them. That image alone has helped secure their immortality. In life, secrecy defined them. Their meetings had to be hidden, their tenderness stolen from the structures that forbade it. Their closeness existed in danger, beneath the shadow of betrayal and death. But in the afterlife Dante imagines, they are permanently paired. Punishment preserves what the world denied. The irony is unbearable. They are united at last, but in ruin. They are not torn apart, yet neither are they granted peace.
Not
There is something almost cruelly compassionate in that vision. Dante does not imagine them screaming at each other, reproaching each other, or shrinking apart in shame. He lets them remain what they were at the center of their tragedy. Two souls bound by a love that did not cease when life did. But he also refuses to romanticize the cost. Their togetherness is inseparable from the storm. They cannot hold each other and come to rest. They cannot step out of motion into a quiet place where love might finally become gentle. They remain close, but closeness itself has become part of the sorrow. The very thing they desired most is now fixed within a punishment that denies release. This is one of Dante's deepest powers as a poet. He does not flatten human beings into single meanings. Paolo and Francesca are not presented merely as adulterers receiving the proper sentence, nor are they offered as innocent martyrs who deserve no blame. Instead, they appear in that difficult space where moral judgment and pity coexist. They have sinned. The poem does not conceal that. They belong in the circle of the lustful, because in Dante's understanding, they allowed passion to rule where reason should have governed. Their story is one of transgression, but they are also shown as sufferers, and Dante insists that we feel the weight of that suffering. This double vision is what makes their presence unforgettable. We are not allowed the comfort of simplicity. To condemn them outright feels inadequate because their grief is too human, too recognizable, too tenderly rendered. To excuse them entirely also feels false, because the poem is shaped by a moral order in which choices matter, vows matter, consequences matter. Dante creates tension and never releases it. He invites us to see them as responsible and wounded at the same time. That complexity is not a weakness in the story. It is the reason it continues to breathe. In the second circle, desire is no longer glamorous. There are no secret glances, no illuminated chamber, no rustle of pages between two readers discovering themselves in a book. That moment belongs to memory. Here, what remains is aftermath. The storm strips away the beauty that once surrounded the feeling and shows what unchecked passion becomes when viewed from eternity. And yet, even stripped of earthly romance, Paolo and Francesca are not emptied of dignity. Their suffering is rendered with such tenderness that they emerge less as examples in a sermon than as souls suspended forever between guilt and grace denied. Dante's own response within the poem is crucial to their legacy. He is not a cold observer cataloguing punishments from a safe distance. He looks, listens, and is moved. That matters because the poem teaches readers not only what to think about hell, but how to feel while passing through it. When Dante encounters the lustful, he does not react with triumph or contempt. He is shaken by the spectacle of desire become torment. And when Paolo and Francesca draw near, the moral architecture of hell remains intact. Yet emotion floods the scene. The poet leaves room for tears. This is where their story changes forever. Before Dante, they belonged primarily to a world of family alliances, political realities, private betrayal, and violent reprisal. Their tragedy could have remained one more noble scandal, one more cautionary tale buried in medieval memory. But Dante lifts it into a visionary landscape where every human act acquires cosmic consequence. He makes their love answerable to eternity, and by doing so he enlarges it beyond anecdote. They cease to be merely historical figures. They become symbols, but not cold ones. They become the image of love that was real and doomed, guilty and pitiable, condemned yet still speaking. That last element is perhaps the most important of all. Countless lovers in literature suffer. Countless sinners in religious imagination are punished. But Paolo and Francesca endure with such force because Dante gives their love language, and not just any language. He gives it a voice of aching gentleness. He does not let them remain distant shapes in the gale. He lets one of them speak. And through that speech, generations of readers have felt the boundary between judgment and compassion begin to tremble. Even before Francesca's famous words are heard, the conditions for their effect are already in place. We have seen the storm. We understand the logic of the punishment. We know these souls are condemned. The setting itself prepares us to hear something harsh, frantic, or grotesque. Instead, what comes from within that violence is delicacy. This contrast is devastating. Against the roaring wind, against the darkness of hell, against the sentence they cannot escape, Dante places not a howl but a human voice capable of tenderness. And in doing so, he accomplishes something extraordinary. He makes damnation intimate. It would have been possible to present Paolo and Francesca as a warning only, to make them objects of fear or disgust. Medieval moral literature often had clear uses for such figures, but Dante is a far greater artist than that. He understands that the deepest moral truths are not always served by reducing people to examples. Sometimes truth requires preserving the tremor of feeling, the mixed motives, the helplessness people half create and half suffer. Paolo and Francesca matter because their sin is recognizable not as monstrosity, but as something perilously close to ordinary human weakness magnified by circumstance, secrecy, loneliness, and desire. That recognition is precisely what has carried them through the centuries. Readers do not remember them simply because they broke a commandment or died for forbidden love. They remember them because Dante refuses to let their interior humanity vanish inside the verdict against them. He shows that a person can be judged and still be mourned. He shows that punishment may be deserved and yet still heartbreaking to witness. He shows, too, that love itself does not become unreal merely because it becomes sinful. This is dangerous terrain, morally and emotionally, and Dante walks into it with astonishing steadiness. So their legacy is born not only from what happened between them, but from the way the poet frames what happened. He places them in a universe where actions echo forever, but he also grants them the grave beauty of being understood in their frailty. His hell is a place of justice, but it is also crowded with memories, voices, regrets, and broken forms of longing. Paolo and Francesca fit that landscape with painful perfection. They are condemned, yes, but they are not erased. They remain visible to us as feeling beings. Their story is not absolved, it is immortalized, and this is why, for generations afterward, painters, composers, sculptors, playwrights, and readers return to them again and again. Not because Dante settled the case, but because he deepened it. Not because he freed them from blame, but because he surrounded their blame with sorrow. He understood that some stories survive because they expose a fault in the human heart that no era outgrows. Passion still overwhelms, people still mistake intensity for destiny. Love still arrives entangled with loneliness, vanity, fantasy, hunger, and genuine tenderness. We still do not know what to do with stories in which wrong and love appear together. Dante knew that. He wrote into that confusion rather than away from it. In his hands, Paolo and Francesca become more than lovers punished for adultery. They become the enduring image of what it means for human longing to outstrip the structures meant to contain it. They become a warning, but also a lament. They become evidence that the soul can be responsible for its undoing and still awaken compassion. They become unforgettable because the poet does not leave them sealed in silence. He lets the wind carry them toward us, and in that terrible motion he allows one tenderness to survive, the tenderness of being heard. And within that storm, it is Francesca's voice that reaches across centuries with almost unbearable softness. Of all the voices crying out amid that turning wind, hers is the one that history has chosen to remember most tenderly and most sorrowfully. What Dante gives her is not merely testimony. It is cadence, courtesy, restraint. She does not rush at us with self-defense, and she does not cry out in the language of scandal. She speaks as though she still belongs to a refined world of measured words, as though even in damnation she remains shaped by the manners of courts, poems, and intimate conversation. Her speech falls with the grace of someone trained to soothe rather than to accuse. That is part of what makes it so devastating. In a place defined by punishment, she sounds almost welcoming. In a realm of shrieks and ruin, she speaks with gentleness. Her first movement toward Dante is one of courtesy. She addresses him as if he were an honored guest, not an intruder in hell. She notices that he is alive. She notices his pity. She answers not with bitterness but with a kind of formal tenderness. The effect is immediate and disarming. We expect the damned to howl, perhaps to justify themselves with fury, perhaps to curse the justice that placed them there. Francesca does something far more powerful. She invites attention through poise. She makes sorrow elegant. She turns confession into something like music. That musical quality matters. Her speech does not feel built like an argument, even though it contains one. It moves by recurring phrases, by emotional symmetry, by the gentle inevitability of one line leading into the next. The repeated invocation of love gives the passage the structure of a refrain. We hear not a legal defense but a lyrical pattern, each sentence returning us to the same center. Love did this, love seized this heart, love joined with these two, love brought them to one death. The words flow with such balance that for a moment they seem to suspend judgment itself. We are not listening for evidence. We are listening under a spell, and that spell is not accidental. Francesca speaks in the language of courtly love, the language that had long taught audiences to imagine desire as ennobling, irresistible, even sacred in its intensity. In that tradition, love is not merely a feeling one chooses to entertain. It arrives like destiny. It recognizes worth. It takes root in the noble heart. It answers beauty with devotion and devotion with suffering. Francesca reaches for precisely that language, and by doing so, she places her story inside a cultural grammar her listeners would know deeply. She does not present herself as crude or reckless. She presents herself as one overtaken by the very force that poetry had so often taught people to admire. This is why her most famous lines remain so haunting. Love, she says, quickly seizes the gentle heart. Love, which excuses no one loved from loving in return, took hold of him because of her beauty. Love led them to one death. The sequence is exquisite, almost liturgical. It feels complete, polished, fated. Every line gives love another attribute, swift, sovereign, reciprocal, fatal. It is as if she is tracing not the history of a decision, but the unfolding of a law of nature. In her telling, love is not one impulse among many. It is the governing principle beneath all that followed. There is something deeply seductive in this logic, because it speaks to a human wish many people understand. We often long to believe that the strongest parts of our emotional lives are larger than choice, that the heart does not so much decide as discover what it cannot refuse. Francesca gives that longing perfect expression. She makes desire sound like recognition. She makes mutual attraction sound like necessity. She turns two people's forbidden attachment into the consequence of beauty, sensitivity, and emotional truth. Her words suggest that once love truly appears, resistance becomes almost unreal, as though to deny it would be a betrayal, not of law but of life itself. Yet Dante is too subtle a poet to let us rest entirely inside her version. Francesca's speech is beautiful, but beauty here is not the same as innocence. In fact, part of the genius of the episode is that the loveliness of her language becomes the very medium through which ambiguity enters. She speaks as though love acted and she was acted upon. Love seized, love took, love led. The grammar shifts agency away from the lovers and onto an abstract force. That shift is emotionally persuasive because it reflects how passion often feels from within. Sudden, overwhelming, as if one's own will has been overtaken. But the more closely we listen, the more we sense what her poetry softens. Love may arrive unbidden, but people still answer it. They dwell in it, nourish it, conceal it, justify it, or turn away from it. Francesca's speech rarely lingers on those middle spaces where choice operates most quietly and most decisively. She does not narrate deliberation. She does not dwell on hesitation. She does not say, "We knew and continued." Instead, she gives us the smooth arc of inevitability. That is not simply deception. It is something more intimate and more human. It is self-understanding shaped by feeling. She has interpreted her life through the language that made it bearable to her. She tells the story in a way that allows love to remain magnificent even in ruin. This is why her speech feels so true and yet so incomplete. It is true to the inner experience of being overcome. It is incomplete in relation to moral reality. Dante does not interrupt her to correct her, and that restraint is crucial. He allows her words to stand in their full emotional force. He lets us feel why a soul might continue to speak this way even after death, even after judgment. Francesca is not arguing before a tribunal anymore. She is inhabiting the story by which she still knows herself. And in that story, love is both ecstasy and explanation. The famous scene of the book deepens this complexity. Francesca recounts how she and Paolo were reading together, alone, a romancer of Lancelot and Guinevere. They read of another forbidden love, another moment of surrender, another kiss mediated by literature. Again, her tone is delicate, almost hushed. There is no sensationalism in her account. She lingers on small details, on repeated glances, on the color draining from them as they read. Then comes the turning point. The moment they reach the passage where the lovers kiss, and Paolo kisses her. That day we read no more. It is one of the most famous endings to a sentence in world literature because it says everything by saying almost nothing. Even here, the music of understatement does immense work. She does not describe passion in explicit terms. She lets silence complete the scene. The halted reading becomes the sign of a life crossing its threshold. But again, the language gently deflects agency. The book seems almost enchanted, a go-between, a pander. The story they read appears to have conducted them toward their own. Literature itself becomes implicated, not falsely, because stories do shape desire. They can authorize feelings, refine fantasies, provide scripts for action. Francesca understands this. Yet the elegance of the telling still veils the active human consent hidden inside that pause, that glance, that kiss. A book can invite, it cannot choose. Two readers must still close the distance. This doubleness is exactly why listeners are moved. We hear a woman neither crudely lying nor fully confessing. We hear someone who reveals herself most deeply in what she cannot quite admit plainly. Her tenderness persuades us because it contains real tenderness. Her sorrow persuades us because it is real sorrow. The tragedy is not invented by rhetoric. She loved and was loved. She longs tolls. The pathos is genuine, but genuine pathos does not erase responsibility. Dante holds both truths in the same trembling frame, and it is in that frame that pity becomes so complicated and so profound. Dante the pilgrim is overwhelmed by Francesca. He does not stand at a safe distance, coolly classifying sin. He listens and he responds as a human being before he responds as a moral observer. The poem tells us that he is moved to tears and eventually to collapse. That response matters because it reveals what the episode asks of us. We are not meant to admire adultery. We are not meant to conclude that because suffering is eloquent, justice must be wrong. But neither are we permitted the easy comfort of contempt. Francesca's speech makes contempt impossible. She speaks from within a punishment that already exceeds any petty appetite for blame. The storm around her is relentless, and her words emerge not in defiance of that suffering but through it. She has become one of literature's clearest examples of how a person can be morally compromised and emotionally legible at the same time. We recognize ourselves not necessarily in her act, but in her way of narrating pain, in the human instinct to describe our most dangerous desires as though they came from somewhere beyond us. We know that instinct. We know how often people turn their choices into destinies after the fact, not always out of malice, but because longing rearranges memory. That recognition is part of what undoes Dante. Francesca is not a monster from whom he can recoil. She is articulate, wounded, cultivated, and heartbreakingly lucid about the sweetness that destroyed her. The poem does not ask us to deny the sweetness. In fact, it insists on it. If there were nothing beautiful in the experience she describes, her words would not matter as they do. The danger lies precisely there. Evil in this scene does not arrive looking ugly. It arrives in beauty, in sympathy, in mirrored feeling, in shared reading, in the tender narrowing of the world to two people and one moment. Francesca's voice preserves that beauty, even as the landscape around her declares its cost. And so her speech becomes one of the most emotionally resonant moments in literature, because it reveals how pity and judgment can coexist without cancelling each other. Within Dante's moral universe, she is condemned. The poem does not revoke that verdict, yet the poet grants her language so graceful, so memorable, so piercingly human, that generations of listeners have felt their certainty tremble. That trembling is not a failure of the poem, it is its achievement. Dante understands that moral truth, if it is to penetrate the heart, must pass through compassion as well as law. Francesca's voice opens that passage. She remains unforgettable because she sounds less like a sinner delivering a case than like a soul still singing the last song that made life feel meaningful. The song is broken, but not silenced. It carries self-deception and sincerity in the same breath. It mourns what it should have written out. It beautifies what destroyed it. It asks for pity without quite asking for absolution. And because it does all this with such delicacy, we do not merely analyze her. We grieve with her, even while knowing grief cannot change the truth of where she stands. That is the terrible tenderness of the scene. Francesca's speech does not free her from judgment, but it frees her from simplification. She is neither reduced to her sin nor excused by her suffering. She is heard in full music, courteous, sorrowful, persuasive, incomplete. Her words float through the infernal wind, like something too gentle for the place that carries them, and that contrast makes them more piercing still. Hell roars around her, but she speaks as if from the chamber of a memory, as if refinement itself were one final possession the storm could not tear away. And perhaps that is why her voice lingers long after the canto ends. We do not remember only what happened to Francesca. We remember how she says it, how love in her mouth becomes law, lament, and veil all at once. We remember the ache of hearing responsibility softened into fate, and of still sensing the human hand beneath the silk. We remember that Dante, faced with such sorrow, does not answer with debate. He faints. Yet Francesca's voice is only half the silence, because beside her stands Paolo, speaking through tears rather than words. His silence is not absence. It is grief in a different register, one that asks for no eloquence in order to be understood. That detail is so small on the page that it can almost pass unnoticed. Francesca tells the story. Francesca shapes the past. Francesca answers Dante's question with elegance and sorrow. And Paolo, the man with whom she shared the kiss, the desire, the death, remains nearly voiceless. He is there, but not in the same way. He does not explain. He does not defend himself. He does not reach for rhetoric. He weeps. In a poem where speech carries such power, that absence matters. Dante is never careless about who speaks and who does not. Voices in the commedia reveal character, desire, self-knowledge, self-deception. Some souls cannot stop talking because they still hunger to control their image. Some confess, some accuse, some preach, some seduce with language even after death. So when Paolo does not join Francesca, when he leaves the shaping of memory entirely to her, the silence becomes more than omission. It becomes characterization. It tells us something intimate, perhaps even unbearable, about the kind of suffering he embodies. Francesca's grief moves outward, it seeks form, it turns pain into narrative, memory into cadence. She can still arrange the past into sentences and draw dignity from articulation. Her speech is not simple honesty, but it is a kind of survival. She speaks because speaking allows her to remain herself, or at least the self she wishes to preserve before Dante's listening pity. Her words gather around her like a final garment. Even in damnation, she is composed enough to tell the story beautifully. Paolo is composed in another way, or perhaps not composed at all. He is the one who breaks. The tradition remembers him as the weeping figure, overcome while Francesca recounts the scene. That image has a strange force because it reverses what we might expect. He was in life the knightly man, the beloved, the object of Francesca's longing. In another kind of story, he might be given the language of romantic declaration, the thrilling speech, the defense of passion. But Dante withholds all that. Instead, Paolo is reduced to tears, and in that reduction he becomes painfully human. There are emotions too deep to organize. There are sorrows that cannot pass through the narrow gate of explanation. Paolo's silence suggests that he inhabits that region. If Francesca can still tell the story, Paolo seems trapped inside it. She remembers. He relives. She presents the wound. He bleeds from it. That difference matters. It creates not a contradiction between them, but an asymmetry, and in that asymmetry the tragedy opens wider. His silence can be heard first as grief. Not general grief, not the abstract sadness of punishment, but a grief attached to one moment that never ends. Francesca's words return them to the reading, to the glance, to the kiss, to the fatal crossing of a boundary. We may imagine that every retelling sharpens the memory for him, instead of softening it. Some memories become stories because we have survived them enough to place them at a distance. But some remain too close. Some are still happening inside us. Paolo's tears suggest precisely that. The past has not become past. It lives in him as immediate pain, and there is shame there too, though not necessarily the cold shame of moral instruction. It may be the shame of exposure, of seeing their most private surrender repeated before a stranger, even a compassionate stranger. Francesca can turn the intimacy of their fall into poetry. Paolo may not bear the transformation. To hear the sacred privacy of desire translated into narrative may wound him anew. To stand before Dante under the gaze of judgment, while the story of their passion is spoken aloud, may be more than he can endure with words. That wordlessness also carries tenderness. This is one of the quiet marvels of the scene. Paolo's silence does not feel empty, it feels inhabited by feeling. We do not hear him say that he loves Francesca. We do not hear him claim that he regrets nothing, or everything, or both. Yet the fact that he weeps while she speaks draws them closer, not farther apart. It suggests an attunement so deep that speech is almost unnecessary. He does not interrupt her version. He does not compete with it. He lets her voice stand for both of them, while his tears answer from within. It is as if she gives the shape of the memory, and he gives its pulse. In that sense, silence becomes devotion, not heroic devotion, not a grand gesture, but helpless devotion. He cannot save her. He cannot alter what happened. He cannot rescue their story from judgment. He cannot even defend their love in his own terms. All he can do is remain beside her in sorrow, visibly undone by the same remembered sweetness that destroyed them. There is something almost more faithful in that than in any declaration. Speech can persuade, excuse, adorn. Tears cannot do much except reveal that the heart is still captive. And perhaps that helplessness is exactly why Paolo is so moving. Human beings often imagine that what is deepest in us will emerge clearly if only we are given the chance to speak. But often the opposite is true. What matters most is where language fails. We know the sensation in our own lives, the moment when apology, explanation, grief, love all become too heavy for sentences. The mouth opens, and nothing adequate comes. Paolo lives in that failure. He is not mute because he has nothing to say, but because what he feels has surpassed speech. This gives him a different kind of dignity from Francesca's. She remains memorable because she is eloquent. He becomes memorable because he is not. Her suffering is shaped by memory, by narration, by the ongoing act of making sense. His suffering is shaped by mute endurance. She can still move through the corridors of causation. We read, we desired, we kissed, we were slain. He seems already beyond sequence, beyond argument, beyond even self-description. What remains is the raw fact of pain. That contrast deepens both of them. If Francesca stood alone, the scene might tilt too far toward performance, however sincere that performance may be. Her lyric sorrow could seem almost too polished, too self-aware, too artfully veiled. Paolo's tears keep the episode from floating entirely into verbal beauty. He anchors it in the body. He reminds us that behind every graceful recollection of ruin, there is also ruin that cannot speak gracefully at all. Behind every memorable line about love, there may be someone simply breaking. And if Paolo stood alone, the tragedy would be less layered. We might see only suffering, not the strange human need to narrate suffering. Together, they reveal two forms of pain that often coexist in us. One part of the self wants to tell the story, to order the chaos, to choose words that make the hurt bearable and intelligible. Another part cannot be consoled by language and remains flooded, speechless, undone. Francesca and Paolo become, in this way, more than historical or literary lovers. They become recognizable states of the soul. It is worth pausing over how generous and how severe that portrayal is. Dante does not give Paolo an absolving speech. He does not let him become a martyr of pure feeling. Silence is moving, but it is not innocence. A man may weep and still be guilty. Tears do not erase choices. Yet Dante also refuses to harden him into a mere example of lust punished. He grants him the reality of sorrow. He lets us see that moral failure and emotional truth can inhabit the same figure. Paolo suffers not because his love was holy, but because his love was human. And human love can destroy as surely as it can ennoble. That complexity may explain why readers so often feel protective of him. There is something defenseless about a character who does not manage his own legacy in words. Francesca has agency within language. Paolo seems stripped even of that. We are left to read him through a gesture of grief. And because gestures can be more open than speeches, we pour into them our own understanding. We see remorse, longing, shame, loyalty, dependence, loss. We imagine the things he cannot say, that he wishes the moment had never come, that he would choose it again, that he cannot forgive himself, that he cannot stop loving her. Silence makes room for all of these possibilities at once. This is why his near silence feels so haunting in the tradition of the story. Later artists, poets, painters, composers often linger over the pair together, but again and again one senses the same division. Francesca as voice, Paolo as wound. He becomes the silent counterpart, the listening sufferer, the man defined by response rather than declaration, and strangely, that does not diminish him. It enlarges him into a mystery. We never fully possess him because he never fully speaks himself into our grasp. There is also, perhaps, a painful gendered tenderness in the arrangement. Francesca bears the burden of speaking, of framing, of making the private public. Paolo bears the burden of being seen in collapse. Neither role is easy, neither is complete. Together they suggest that intimacy often divides itself unevenly. One remembers aloud, one cannot. One explains, one trembles, one carries the words, one carries what words cannot carry. Tragic love is not only made of shared feeling, it is also made of different capacities for bearing that feeling. And this is where the episode becomes especially close to life. We often think love is proved by what lovers say to one another, by vows, confessions, promises. But some of the truest things in love are wordless: the inability to leave, the involuntary tears, the posture of a body that still turns toward another even in ruin. Paolo's silence belongs to that realm. It suggests that pain itself has become his language, not because silence is nobler than speech, but because, for him, speech has been overtaken. That does not make Francesca false. It simply makes them different. She survives through telling. He survives, if this can be called survival, through feeling. She preserves the memory in form. He preserves its cost in visible grief. Together they embody a tragic wholeness. We understand their love not only because we hear it described, but because we witness what it does to the one who cannot describe it at all. So Paolo remains beside Francesca as one of literature's quietest presences and one of its most affecting. He says almost nothing, and because of that, we listen harder. We search his tears for what no argument can settle. Was it love? Was it weakness? Was it tenderness corrupted by circumstance? Was it a single yielding that became an eternity of loss? Dante gives us no clarifying speech from Paolo, and that refusal is part of the power. Some hearts are known not by their explanations, but by the grief they cannot hide. From that silence and that speech, generations of readers begin asking the same uneasy question: should these lovers be condemned, pitied, or both? That question lingers because the story stands at the meeting point of two truths that do not comfortably live together. In the moral world that shaped Dante's imagination, adultery was never a private matter between two lonely hearts. It was a grave disorder of love itself. It violated marriage, threatened lineage and inheritance, damaged trust between families, and wounded the soul by turning desire away from its rightful order. To modern ears, romance can sound like a personal claim, an inward truth that asks only to be honored. But in the medieval Christian framework, the self was not sovereign in that way. Human passion belonged within a structure of duty, sacrament, and communal stability. To betray that structure was not simply to follow one's heart. It was to break faith with God, with society, and with promises that held the world together. That perspective matters, because without it, the full force of the condemnation is flattened into something simplistic, almost cruel. Dante does not place Francesca and Paolo among the damned because he is incapable of feeling their pain. He places them there because, within his moral vision, feeling does not erase responsibility. Love, or what presents itself as love, is not automatically innocent simply because it is intense. Desire can be sincere and still destructive. A bond can be emotionally real and spiritually disordered at the same time. This is the hard edge of the story, and it is one reason it continues to trouble us. We live in a culture that often treats authentic feeling as its own defense. Dante asks something more difficult. He asks whether a feeling can be deeply human, moving, and understandable, yet still lead us into ruin. And yet the poem does not present Paolo and Francesca as cold symbols of vice. It gives them breath, sorrow, memory, beauty, trembling words. Francesca does not speak like a villain. She speaks like someone who has known hunger for tenderness and found it in the wrong place. Her voice carries refinement, vulnerability, and self-justification in equal measure. She remembers the moment of reading, the shared silence, the kiss, and the loss of control that followed. There is no monstrous delight in wrongdoing there. There is longing, weakness, susceptibility, and the intoxicating relief of being seen. That is why audiences so often grieve for them before they judge them. The story is designed to make us feel the pull of recognition. We hear not only about sin, but about need. Perhaps that is the deepest source of sympathy. Many people know what it means to be starved for affection long before they ever know what to call it. They know the ache of emotional neglect, the danger of kindness arriving too late, the way loneliness can sharpen every gesture into promise. Francesca's world is aristocratic, political, and distant from ours in form, but not in feeling. If she was indeed bound in a marriage arranged for strategy rather than mutual love, then her vulnerability was not created in a single reckless instant. It was shaped over time by a life in which duty may have been abundant but tenderness scarce. Paolo, too, appears not as a predator from outside the household, but as someone drawn close enough to understand what was missing. In that closeness, restraint failed. We may condemn the act and still recognize the human conditions that made it possible. This is where the story unsettles easy judgment. It does not ask us to pretend that vows mean nothing. It does not ask us to celebrate betrayal as liberation. But neither does it allow us to imagine that moral failure happens in a vacuum, committed by people untouched by pressure, fear, loneliness, or constraint. The lovers made a choice, yes, yet their choice emerged inside systems they did not design. Francesca's marriage was almost certainly shaped by family ambition. Her role as a woman was tightly bounded by political necessity and male authority. Her emotional life was not considered the central issue. Paolo moved within the same web of kinship, loyalty, and expectation. What happened between them violated that web, but the web itself was hardly a place of freedom and flourishing. The tragedy sharpens because the social order that condemns them is also part of what formed the misery from which their desire arose. This is not an argument that coercive systems erase guilt. It is an argument that they complicate it. We are often tempted by clear categories, innocent victims on one side, guilty transgressors on the other. Paolo and Francesca refuse that neat division. They suffer, and they also cause suffering. They are constrained, and they also consent. They are moved by genuine feeling, and they also betray sacred and social bonds. That tension is morally exhausting, which is precisely why the tale remains alive. It mirrors the discomfort of real human life, where wrong actions are often tangled with unmet needs, and where compassion can coexist with moral seriousness. Dante himself becomes part of this conflict. He listens to Francesca, and he is overcome. He faints. That response matters enormously. The poet does not stand at a safe distance, untouched by what he sees. He is shaken by pity. He feels the emotional force of her story, perhaps even the seduction of her rhetoric. But the architecture of the poem does not change because he is moved. The lovers remain in the storm. The emotional truth of their suffering is acknowledged without being allowed to overturn the moral order. This is one of the most daring things the episode does. It admits that compassion is necessary, yet warns that compassion alone cannot be the final measure of justice. For many readers, that is still unbearable. They wonder whether the punishment is too severe, whether eternal condemnation can ever be reconciled with such recognizable frailty. Francesca and Paolo did not conquer kingdoms through cruelty. They did not delight in bloodshed. They kissed while reading a love story and stepped across a line from which they could not return. Compared to other forms of human evil, their offense can seem heartbreakingly small, and yet Dante places them in hell, not because their sin is the worst, but because its danger lies in its sweetness. Lust in this vision is not terrifying because it looks monstrous. It is terrifying because it feels persuasive, beautiful, and justified from within. It can persuade a person that surrender is innocence. That is another reason audiences grieve for the lovers. They sense how thin the boundary can be between admiration for love and alarm at what love can excuse. Most people do not fear passion because it is ugly. They fear it because it can seem noble while asking us to betray what we owe others. Francesca and Paolo are not tragic because they loved. They are tragic because love arrived in a morally compromised form, inside an already damaged arrangement, and demanded a loyalty that could not be honored without breaking another. There is no path in their story that does not wound someone. Even if we imagine them as victims of an unchosen marriage and a loveless world, their intimacy still unfolds within another man's claim, another family's honor, another set of obligations. The tenderness is real, so is the harm. That coexistence is what makes the story more than a simple warning against desire. It becomes a meditation on disordered longing in a disordered world. If all structures were just, if all marriages were freely chosen, if all needs for affection were met with dignity, then perhaps moral judgment would be cleaner. But that is not the world of Paolo and Francesca, and it is not ours either. People fail each other inside imperfect institutions. They seek warmth where they should not. They confuse being understood with being permitted. They mistake the relief of intimacy for a sign of moral rightness. The tale does not excuse these confusions, but it shows how human they are. Its power lies partly in refusing to mock the weakness it condemns. Francesca's own telling intensifies this ambiguity. She speaks of love as if it were a force that seized them, almost an external power. Love, she suggests, led one beloved heart to the other and allowed no defense. There is truth in that language, because desire can indeed feel larger than the will, as if one is carried rather than choosing, but there is also evasion in it. To speak this way is to soften agency, to make surrender sound inevitable. Dante lets us hear how beautiful that explanation is, and how dangerous. Many people narrate their own transgressions through the grammar of helplessness. The heart could not help itself. Circumstances left no choice. Emotions swept everything away. Sometimes those words express genuine experience. Sometimes they hide from responsibility. Often they do both at once. Francesca's speech is so haunting because it inhabits that uncertain middle ground. And perhaps that is why the debate never ends. Some readers hear in her voice a woman denied freedom, punished forever for reaching toward love in a life arranged without her consent. Others hear a brilliant self-defense that transforms adultery into poetry and asks pity to do the work of absolution. Most feel both responses at once. We recoil from the betrayal, yet ache for the betrayed self within the betrayer. We see the wreckage their choice implies, yet we also see two people caught in emotional famine, finding in each other the gentleness they lacked elsewhere. The moral conflict persists because the story knows that human beings are rarely one thing at a time. They can be wounded and wounding, sincere and self-deceiving, loving and destructive. This is what gives Paolo and Francesca their enduring place in the imagination. Their story does not survive because it proves that love conquers all. It survives because it asks what happens when love, or something very close to love, enters a landscape already shaped by force, hierarchy, silence, and unmet need. It asks whether our pity should expand our understanding without collapsing our judgment. It asks whether condemnation can remain morally coherent once we have truly listened to the condemned. And it asks us to sit with a painful possibility that the heart may discover something precious in a place where it should not have sought it, and that the precious thing does not become pure simply because it is precious. So when audiences instinctively mourn Paolo and Francesca, they are not necessarily rejecting morality. They may be responding to a deeper intuition that justice without compassion becomes inhuman, and that any account of wrongdoing that ignores sorrow is incomplete. But the story presses back against another danger as well. Compassion without moral clarity can become sentimentality, and sentimentality can bless what it ought to grieve. The lovers are not saved by our tears, yet our tears are part of what the episode demands. It wants us to feel the ache of their humanity, while still confronting the damage woven into their embrace. That unresolved ache is the center of the tale's afterlife. We return to it because it captures a conflict that no age has solved. How should we judge acts born partly from deprivation, especially when they bring real tenderness into barren lives? How do we hold people accountable without forgetting the conditions that bent them toward failure? What do we do with loves that feel true to those who live them, but arrive through betrayal and leave suffering behind? Paolo and Francesca do not answer these questions, they deepen them. And because the story refuses simple answers, artists after Dante keep returning to it in search of new meanings. And because the story refuses simple answers, artists after Dante keep returning to it in search of new meanings. What is remarkable is not only how often Paolo and Francesca reappear, but how differently they are seen each time. In one age, they are the very image of irresistible passion, swept beyond reason by desire. In another, they become victims of a world arranged without their consent, two people crushed between duty, violence, and political convenience. Elsewhere, they are treated almost as martyrs of feeling itself, souls whose crime was not merely adultery, but the insistence that the heart has claims the world cannot fully regulate. Their names travel through centuries, and with each retelling, the emphasis shifts. Yet the emotional pulse remains recognizable. Painters were among the first to seize the scene and give it a body the imagination could linger over. Dante's account is already deeply visual. The storm, the circling shades, the brief stillness of speech in the midst of endless motion. It offered artists everything they needed: movement, beauty, danger, pity, and a pair of figures suspended between touch and loss. In some canvases, Paolo and Francesca are rendered as almost weightless beings, carried in a dark wind that makes their closeness seem both tender and hopeless. Their bodies lean toward one another, but the space around them never lets them rest. The air itself becomes punishment. Love is present, but it is denied all shelter. Other painters focus not on the afterlife, but on the moment before ruin, the charged instant of reading together. This choice changes everything. Instead of condemned shades, we see a man and woman indoors, still among the living, still surrounded by the ordinary textures of the world: fabric, light, furniture, the hush of a private room. The book lies between them like an accomplice and a mirror. A glance lasts a second too long. A hand hesitates. The kiss has not yet happened, or has just happened, and the entire tragedy seems to gather inside that pause. In these versions, the viewers are not simply asked to witness punishment. They are invited into temptation, into the fragile threshold where emotion turns into action. The scene feels intimate enough to be understood, and dangerous enough to be feared. This is one reason the story proved so powerful in later Romantic culture. The Romantics were drawn to intensity, to the individual heart in conflict with law, custom, and fate. Paolo and Francesca offered all of that in concentrated form. Their love could be imagined as authentic in a world of arranged bonds and cold calculations. Their suffering could be seen as proof that deep feeling and social order often stand in collision. For artists and readers shaped by that sensibility, the lovers were no longer merely sinners caught in deserved consequence. They became symbols of a deeper tragedy, that the very capacities that make us most human, imagination, longing, tenderness, surrender, can lead us toward destruction. Poets found in them a language for love that arrives too late. That is one of the quiet devastations of the tale. Their union does not grow in freedom. It blooms in secrecy, under the shadow of another bond, and therefore can never ripen into an open life. So many later writers seized on that condition. They recognized in Paolo and Francesca not simply forbidden desire, but the sorrow of emotional timing gone wrong. The right feeling comes in the wrong circumstances. The soul meets its answering soul only after promises, institutions, and consequences have already closed in. That pattern is painfully familiar across generations. It is one reason the pair seem larger than their medieval origin. They begin to stand for every love discovered when there is no honorable path left to it. Composers, too, heard something irresistible in the story. Music can do what argument cannot. It can hold conflicting truths in the same breath. In works inspired by Paolo and Francesca, one often hears the surge of desire, the sweep of fatality, the tenderness of recognition, and the violence of judgment all at once. A melody may rise as if love were a release into wholeness, only to be broken by dissonance or swallowed by darker currents. The storm of the second circle becomes sound, a force without landing place. Passion is not presented as simple pleasure. It is restless, breathless, beautiful, and already edged with doom. Through music, the lovers become not just characters but an emotional weather system, carrying listeners through rapture and dread, without granting clean resolution. Playwrights and dramatists often draw the social frame more sharply. On stage is not merely a background fact. It is a public arrangement with witnesses, obligations and consequences. Families gain power through alliances. Women become bargaining pieces. Men are valued for strategic usefulness more than emotional truth. In that setting, Francesca can emerge less as a temptress than as someone placed where choice has already been narrowed almost to nothing. Paolo too can be interpreted in different ways, as weak, as noble, as reckless, as genuinely divided between loyalty and love. Drama thrives on such ambiguity. It asks not only what the lovers felt, but what kind of world made their feelings catastrophic. That question becomes especially important in modern retellings. Many contemporary readers and artists are less interested in judging Paolo and Francesca as isolated moral agents than in examining the structures around them. They ask what it means for a young woman to be married for advantage, perhaps under deception, perhaps with little real consent. They ask how emotional starvation shapes vulnerability. They ask how power, gender, violence, and silence distort the space in which choices are made. In these versions, the tragedy is not only that two people desired wrongly, it is that they lived in a world where honesty, companionship, and mutual recognition were denied legitimate form. Their guilt does not disappear, but it is placed inside a more searching account of injustice. At the same time, not every reinterpretation softens them. Some artists return to the story precisely to restore its spiritual seriousness. They resist the temptation to turn Paolo and Francesca into glamorous rebels or saints of the heart. For these readers, the enduring power of the tale lies in its refusal to flatter desire. Love, however sincere it feels, is not automatically innocent. The self can mistake hunger for truth. The intensity of feeling can eclipse duties owed to others. Beauty can become a veil over harm. In such retellings, Francesca's eloquence is part of the tragedy because it reveals how human beings narrate themselves in ways that protect what they cannot bear to condemn. The lovers remain moving, but the movement is uneasy. We are invited to pity them without surrendering moral depth. This tension between sympathy and judgment is exactly what keeps the story alive. If Paolo and Francesca were only victims, the tale would lose some of its terrible gravity. If they were only culprits, it would lose its heart. Their afterlife in art depends on that unstable middle ground. Every age steps into it with its own fears and desires. Some centuries emphasize the kiss. Others emphasize the marriage contract, the knife, the storm, the book, the tears. Some make the lovers luminous. Others make them haunted. Some ask us to tremble before passion. Others ask us to see how societies create tragedies and then punish the people trapped inside them. The story can bear all these readings because it was never sealed shut. Over time, their names become a kind of shorthand. To invoke Paolo and Francesca is to summon an entire emotional universe, longing that cannot be legitimized, tenderness shadowed by betrayal, happiness so brief, it almost hurts more than deprivation, memory fused forever with transgression. They become larger than biography. Whether or not one knows the political details of 13th century Italy, the emotional pattern is legible. Two people encounter one another in a way that feels irrevocably true, but truth comes bound to ruin. This is why their story moves so easily across borders, mediums, and eras. It speaks a language older than any single text and younger than every new listener who discovers it. Modern storytelling continues to echo them even when it does not mention them by name. In novels, films, theatre and television, we repeatedly meet lovers who find one another under impossible conditions. Sometimes they are divided by marriage, class, duty, war, family expectation, or social taboo. Sometimes the barrier is internal, fear, shame, trauma, timing. Sometimes the relationship is depicted as redemptive, sometimes as destructive, sometimes as both. But the emotional architecture remains familiar. A private recognition blooms where public life offers no room for it. A moment of closeness opens a future that cannot actually be lived. What follows is secrecy, fracture, guilt, or loss. In that sense, Paolo and Francesca are not relics. They are ancestors of a pattern our stories still cannot relinquish. Part of their endurance also lies in the role of reading itself. The lovers are brought together through a tale of another illicit love. They are changed by language, by imagination, by seeing themselves reflected in fiction. Later artists have always understood the power of that detail. It makes Paolo and Francesca not only subjects of art, but also figures within a meditation on what art can do to us. A poem, a book, a performance, a song, these can awaken dormant desires, clarify hidden loneliness, and authorize feelings that had no name before. They can also blur boundaries between fantasy and action. So every retelling of Paolo and Francesca contains, somewhere within it, a quiet question about the audience itself. What are we doing when we are moved by them? Are we learning compassion, indulging romantic illusion, confronting danger, or all of these at once? This may be why their story still reaches so deeply into ordinary emotional life. Most people will never face their exact circumstances, but many know some version of forbidden longing or impossible choice. Many know what it is to meet understanding where they should not seek it, to feel drawn toward what would complicate everything, to discover that the heart does not consult the timetable of propriety. Many also know the pain of looking back and thinking, if this had happened earlier, if the world had been kinder, if one decision had been different, perhaps this could have become a life instead of a wound. Paolo and Francesca give shape to that feeling. They tell us that late love, misaligned love, compromised love, and unsheltered love have always haunted human beings. And yet the story also asks something difficult of us. It asks us to acknowledge that recognition does not equal permission. To understand is not to approve. To feel tenderness for the trapped does not erase the hurt done to others. This is another reason later cultures keep rewriting the lovers. We are still trying to speak honestly about the places where desire and responsibility collide. We are still searching for forms of compassion that do not collapse into excuse, and forms of judgment that do not become cruelty. Paolo and Francesca remain with us because they live exactly where those efforts falter. They are beautiful to imagine, painful to assess, impossible to forget. In painting, they whirl forever. In poetry, they speak in voices alternately seductive and wounded. In music, they rise and break like a wave that cannot reach shore. In theatre, they stand before the structures that made honesty dangerous. In modern retellings, they become mirrors for questions about agency, consent, power, loneliness, and emotional truth. Each age remakes them in its own image, but each age also discovers that the core cannot be fully tamed. At the center are still two human beings who found in each other something unmistakably alive, and found it in a context that turned that aliveness fatal. That is why their names continue to feel less like a historical reference than a pulse. They belong to anyone who has loved under the sign of impossibility, anyone who has felt that a real bond arrived through the wrong door, anyone who has stood between inner truth and outer consequence and known there would be no unbroken outcome. We may not share their world, but we recognize the trembling boundary they crossed. We recognize the danger of wanting what cannot be made clean. We recognize, too, the grief of lives shaped by arrangements that leave no generous room for the heart. And after all the retellings, we return not to spectacle, but to the fragile human ache at the center of their story. That ache is what survives, long after the judgments, the commentaries, the paintings, the poems, and the arguments about guilt have settled into history. What remains before us is an image almost impossible to forget. Two souls carried together in a darkness they did not choose, unable to separate, unable to rest, bound by a love that once felt like refuge and became their ruin. There is tenderness in that image, and there is terror in it too. They are not simply lovers preserved in beauty. They are lovers suspended inside the memory of a choice that cannot be undone. Perhaps that is why their sorrow still lives. It is not only that they loved. Countless lovers have been remembered, and countless more have been lost. It is that their love is inseparable from regret, from pressure, from timing, from the tragic knowledge that a human heart may recognize itself most clearly at the very moment when acting on that recognition becomes destructive. They remain caught between what was deeply felt and what was fatally done. And in that suspended state, they begin to resemble not distant figures from another moral world, but us. Because beneath the historical setting, beneath the medieval language of sin and punishment, their story touches fears that have never belonged to one century alone. It speaks to the fear of being unseen in the life one has been given. The fear of waking inside an arrangement that may look proper from the outside, yet leave something essential in the soul untouched. The fear that one's deepest self may go unanswered for so long that when recognition finally arrives, it feels less like temptation than rescue. There is a loneliness in that, and many people know it even if their circumstances are entirely different. To feel unchosen, unheard, or misread is one of the quiet sorrows of human life. Paolo and Francesca endure because their story gives that sorrow a face. It also speaks to the fear of loving too late. Not simply late in age, but late in circumstance, late in permission, late in the order of a life already shaped by other decisions, duties, and bonds. There is a specific grief in meeting what feels true when the world has already closed around you. We do not need to approve of every choice they made to recognize the pain inside that condition. There are people who spend years learning how to endure what they never would have chosen, and then, when something luminous appears, they are asked to turn away from it in the name of order. Sometimes they do turn away. Sometimes they cannot. Sometimes what arrives too late does not feel late at all, but like the first moment of being fully alive. And then there is the fear of choosing wrongly. Few fears are more human than this. Not the abstract fear of making a mistake, but the unbearable possibility that one may choose from hunger, from need, from longing, from confusion, and only afterward understand the cost. Paolo and Francesca do not live in memory because they were monsters of desire. They live there because they seem terribly human in the way desire and feeling overtook judgment. Their tragedy is not that they felt too little conscience, but that feeling itself became stronger than the structures meant to contain it. In them, we see how frail freedom can become when it is pressed between loneliness and longing, between duty and emotional truth, between the life one is supposed to live and the life one suddenly can imagine. That fragility matters. We often like to think of human and choice as clean, deliberate, and fully sovereign. We imagine that people simply decide, and that moral clarity is available to anyone who wants it enough. But stories like theirs unsettle that comfort. They remind us that freedom is real, yes, but vulnerable. It can be narrowed by fear, by silence, by coercive circumstances, by emotional deprivation, by the longing to be met and known. None of these things erase responsibility, yet neither do they leave responsibility untouched. Paolo and Francesca stand in that difficult middle place, where judgment and pity refuse to separate neatly. This may be one reason they continue to haunt us. We do not remember them only because they transgressed. If transgression alone were enough, history would be crowded with names that still burn and grieve in us. And most do not. We remember them partly because they suffered, because their punishment makes visible the endless motion of a heart that cannot release what destroyed it. Their sorrow is not static. It moves, it circles, it returns. It is wind without home. There is something about that ceaselessness that feels true to grief itself. Some consequences do not end when an act is over. They become atmosphere. They become the element through which the self must keep moving. And yet even suffering does not fully explain their endurance. Many have suffered more and are remembered less. So perhaps we return to them because they reveal something unsettling about the human condition, that love can be genuine and disastrous at once. We are often taught to divide cleanly. True love is imagined as ennobling, pure, redemptive, worth sacrifice. Wrong love is imagined as selfish, corrupt, unreal. But Paolo and Francesca disturb that divide. Their bond is not easy to dismiss as mere illusion. It has warmth, recognition, mutuality. It awakens them, and still it leads them into devastation. That is harder to bear than a simpler moral. It asks us to admit that beauty does not guarantee innocence, and intensity does not protect us from ruin. There is something almost unbearable in holding both truths at once. We want to rescue them into romance or condemn them into warning. We want their story to settle into one lesson, but it resists. If we remember them only as sinners, we flatten the tenderness that made their fall emotionally legible. If we remember them only as victims of love, we erase the damage written into their choices. To keep faith with their sorrow, we have to remain where the story remains, in ambiguity, in compassion, in the painful knowledge that human beings are rarely at their most understandable when they are at their most blameless. This is why their names continue to stir artists, readers, and listeners across centuries. Not because everyone sees themselves exactly in Paolo or in Francesca, but because almost everyone recognizes some edge of the feeling around them. The wish to be truly met, the shock of emotional recognition, the dread that one's necessary truth may arrive wrapped in another form of destruction. The knowledge that choices made in private can echo forever. The ache of wondering whether another life might have been possible under kinder conditions, wiser timing, or a more merciful timing. There is also, in their story, the fear of consequences that never stop speaking. Most people know what it is to carry something beyond the moment that caused it. A sentence said in need, a silence kept too long, a turning toward one person that becomes a turning away from another, a decision that seemed survivable at the time and later appears irreversible. Few lives are free of these shadows. Paolo and Francesca enlarge that ordinary truth into a tragic emblem. They show us what it means for consequence to become permanent weather, for memory itself to become part of the punishment. They cannot simply recall what happened. They are enclosed by it. And still, in that enclosure, they remain together. This is the final complication, and perhaps the deepest source of their power. Their punishment does not erase their bond. Their sorrow does not cancel their tenderness. Even in condemnation, they are not depicted as strangers. They are bound not only by wrongdoing, but by attachment that continues. For some, this makes the story more tragic. For others, more beautiful. For most of us, it makes it harder to judge without trembling. We are left before a mystery that has never been comfortably resolved. Whether the persistence of feeling after disaster proves the dignity of love or only its danger. Maybe the answer is that it proves both. Maybe that is why the story does not die. It offers no clean reassurance, only recognition. It knows that the heart is capable of perceiving something real and still leading us into harm. It knows that tenderness can coexist with irresponsibility, that longing can bloom inside confinement, that emotional truth can emerge in forms the world cannot bless without unraveling itself. It knows too that after the act, after the discovery, after the collapse, what remains is not only blame but mourning. Mourning for what was desired, for what was broken, for what could never be made whole. To think about Paolo and Francesca today is to think about how vulnerable people are when love arrives under pressure. It is to ask what becomes of freedom when choice is constrained before desire even appears. It is to ask whether a person can be at once answerable and profoundly trapped. It is to ask how often human beings are forced into moral terrain already damaged by power, expectation, and emotional neglect. Their story does not excuse betrayal, but it does insist that before we judge the act, we should understand the loneliness around it, the silence before it, the hunger beneath it. That insistence is part of their mercy toward us. They make us slower, less certain, more attentive to the hidden conditions of people's choices. They ask us to look beyond the surface of scandal into the interior life that made the scandal possible. They remind us that what the world labels simply as failure may contain years of deprivation, confusion, and unspoken need. At the same time, they do not let us pretend that need sanctifies everything it seeks. Their lesson is more difficult and more human. It is that feeling can be real without being righteous, and that suffering can be profound without making every action innocent. So we remember them not as symbols with a single meaning, but as a wound in story form. Two souls held together by love, regret, and memory. Two figures forever moving between closeness and punishment. Two names that continue to ask whether being understood by another person is a blessing when it comes at the cost of the world around you. Their sorrow still lives because our questions still live. We still fear invisibility. We still fear lateness. We still fear the wrong door opening onto the truest room. We still fear that one irreversible choice may follow us longer than we can endure. And perhaps we remember them most because they expose how fragile we all are when longing meets circumstance. Not weak in a contemptible sense, but breakable, persuadable, divided, capable of seeing clearly in feeling and dimly in consequence. Their story survives because it refuses the fantasy that the heart always moves in safe directions. Sometimes it reaches toward what feels like salvation and finds judgment waiting there. Sometimes the very thing that awakens a life also destroys its shape. In the end, their names remain in the wind, still mourning, still loving, and still asking what the heart owes to the world. We do not leave them with a verdict that cancels either tenderness or damage. We leave them where they have always been, joined, sorrowful, unforgettable. Their love was beautiful, and it was fatal. And from that unbearable union, their personal tragedy opens outward into the question that still belongs to all of us, whether love is redeemed or ruined when it defies the world.